Hail City, humanity's final fortress, was now nothing but a blazing sea of crimson fire. The sky darkened, choked by the ash and debris of crumbling structures. Relentless explosions ripped through the high-rises, flames rolling up as if eager to swallow everything whole. The devastation was so absolute that streets and ruins had become indistinguishable. Rubble blasted in all directions with every shockwave, thick white smoke billowing from freshly collapsed walls. The entire city trembled violently beneath the crushing weight of the invasion. Amidst the ruins, Colin Hall fell to his knees, his breathing ragged and his body drenched in pale blood. He tried to force himself up, but his physical limits had been shattered by the agonizingly long battle. From behind a shattered wall, a towering figure emerged, a flaming greatsword gripped in its hand. He casually strolled toward Colin, leaving scorched fissures in the earth with every step. The enemy's blade radiated an apocalyptic heat, showering sparks as it tore through the air. The raw power of this weapon alone was enough to melt the strongest steel. This newcomer was a high demon sporting fiery hair and a pair of imposing black horns. He flashed an arrogant smirk, calling out Colin Hall's name like a predator taunting an exhausted prey. Colin forced himself to his feet, one hand clutching the gruesome wound on his chest as he faced the roaring flames. His gaze remained razor-sharp, completely devoid of surrender despite being backed into a corner. Blood trickled down his lips, but Colin never broke eye contact with his executioner. Deep down, he was fighting through the blinding pain, desperately searching for one last opening. The high demon looked down at him from his high horse, dripping with mockery at the sight of Colin as the sole survivor. Hoisting his sword onto his shoulder, he promised the human the privilege of choosing how he died. He grinned, his eyes burning with sheer cruelty beneath the haughty visage of an absolute superior. To him, this slaughter was now just a petty amusement, a game to put down a stubborn dog. Colin glared at his enemy, his blue eyes reflecting the demon's fiery silhouette. He couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end of the line. The demon's reflection sharpened in Colin's pupils as a deathly silence swallowed the moment. Everything began rewinding to the very beginning of this nightmare. 1 year ago, the demon race's invasion kicked off without a single warning. Colossal monsters laid waste to cities, including the imperial capital, moving so fast that humanity never stood a chance. Soldiers and civilians alike were butchered mercilessly in the streets. Pitch-black wings blotted out the sun, and their hellfire incinerated any lingering hope of human resistance. The soldiers fought like hell with their crude weapons, but they were entirely powerless against beasts that wielded magic. Corpses littered the ground, blood soaking deep into the stone steps. In this world, magic was a divine privilege reserved strictly for highborn nobles. No matter how hard a commoner tried, they could never even brush against that kind of power. Marquis Darius Hall watched the battlefield from afar, his expression cold and stoic. He represented the elite families who held the fate of humanity in their hands, all thanks to the magical blood in their veins. The nobles raised their hands in unison, igniting massive magic circles that illuminated the heavens. They firmly believed they were the sole saviors capable of pulling this world back from the brink of annihilation. Countless streams of violent purple energy rained down from the glyphs, triggering massive detonations amidst the enemy ranks. The blinding light of their assault eclipsed the daytime sun. Magic rained down like a meteor shower, leveling the surrounding architecture and incinerating the advancing demon legion. Thick purple smoke billowed up after every magical bombardment. But these arrogant aristocrats never could have guessed that the magic they so proudly wielded was mere child's play to the demons. Dark silhouettes casually strode out of the smoke, their glowing red eyes completely unfazed. A single demon simply raised its hand, summoning an ancient magic circle that instantly choked out humanity's counterattack. Their power was light years beyond the comprehension of these self-proclaimed elites. Demonic flames erupted with terrifying force, swallowing the noble mages who desperately tried to defend themselves. The sheer gap in power caused every defensive line to crumble in the blink of an eye. Panic-stricken, the nobles abandoned their soldiers and citizens, fleeing back into the palace like cowards. Their legendary pride was reduced to absolute terror in the face of imminent death. A gaunt priest stood frozen, his eyes bulging with horror at the massacre unfolding before him. He simply couldn't process that this apocalyptic reality was actually happening. Across the city, fires continued to feast on the corpses of the fallen. Not a single soul was left alive. There was only the chilling silence of a colossal graveyard. Colin Hall looked at his slaughtered comrades, his heart heavy with a crushing wave of regret. If only I had found that book sooner, he thought bitterly, everything would have been different. A battered, ancient grimoire suddenly glowed, cryptic runes flaring to life on its cover. This was the exact power Colin had yearned for to rewrite this tragic destiny. Snapped back to reality, Colin stood amidst the ashes, his disheveled black hair hiding a face covered in deep gashes. A bitter taste coated his mouth. It felt like he was way too late. The High Demon closed in, sneering as he brought up Colin's comrades, who were now nothing but charred meat. He relished the raw agony plastered across the human's face. Swinging his blade, the demon threatened to hack off Colin's limbs or reduce him to a pile of ash like the rest of his trash friends. The crushing pressure of his demonic aura made the very air heavy and hard to breathe. Colin kept his head down, his dark hair masking his eyes, but his voice dripped with venom as he told the demon to shut the hell up. He was completely done listening to the bastard's garbage. The High Demon raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised that a dying insect still had the guts to bark. He tilted his head, curious to see what other pathetic tricks this prey had up his sleeve. Colin reached out and gripped the hilt of a shattered sword lying on the ground. He had made his choice. He would unleash his final, forbidden skill, even knowing the price was his very soul. With an earth-shattering roar, Colin lunged at the demon with blinding speed. The broken blade in his hand erupted with an eerie white light, tearing through the smoke-filled night. The snapped blade clashed violently against the High Demon's flaming sword, unleashing a brutal shockwave. The demon was stunned to see his strike blocked by a half-dead human. Colin poured every ounce of his being into a deafening battle cry, the mana from his very soul igniting. His face contorted in horrific agony as the forbidden skill began tearing his body apart from the inside. The two blades ground against each other in midair, sparks exploding outward with every collision. Colin refused to give an inch, pressing his enemy with an iron will that eclipsed death itself. For the first time, genuine shock washed over the High Demon's face. He could feel an alien, overwhelming power pushing him back. He never imagined a mere human could possess such a terrifying resolve. Seizing a microscopic opening, Colin pivoted and unleashed a flawless, decisive slash. The blade, carrying all his rage and regret, drove straight toward the commander's chest. A massive explosion rocked the battlefield as the strike pierced the demon's armor, unleashing a blinding flash of light. Colin had gambled absolutely everything on this one final attack. The High Demon took a step back, his laughter echoing across the burning wasteland. He mocked the frailty of humanity for lacking the dark blessing of the demon god. He stood tall amidst the sea of fire, brandishing his blazing sword and openly daring Colin to try again. The bastard simply didn't believe that some pathetic human swordsmanship could actually leave a scratch on him. A close-up of the demon's face revealed sheer madness, his eyes burning like hellfire. Drunk on his own overwhelming power, he looked down on humanity's last, desperate struggle. But the High Demon's smug grin vanished the second he realized blood was trickling from the gash on his chest. He was utterly bewildered that a filthy human had actually managed to draw blood. The demon roared in a mix of absolute disbelief and blinding rage. "Impossible!" he bellowed, staring in shock as human swordsmanship shattered his supposedly absolute defense. Colin stared down his enemy with eyes as cold as ice, his left eye flaring with a mystical blue light. He knew damn well that ordinary techniques could never pull off a miracle like this. Gripping the hilt with both hands, Colin braced himself for the next exchange. This wasn't standard swordsmanship anymore. This was a fundamentally different beast altogether. He was wielding the forbidden blade, an art that demanded the user's soul and lifespan as tribute. A blinding white aura enveloped the steel, radiating a suffocating pressure. Colin moved like a phantom, tearing through the air with godlike strikes. The High Demon scrambled to defend himself, forced to parry a warrior who was literally burning his own life away to fight. The two traded blows at breakneck speeds, leaving a chaotic web of light streaks across the dark sky. Every single clash carried enough kinetic force to level the surrounding buildings. Colin relentlessly closed the distance, forcing the demon into a desperate, passive defense. His blade work was an unpredictable storm, denying his enemy even a fraction of a second to breathe. Colin's eyes narrowed as he spotted a fatal flaw in the demon's footwork. He knew this was his one and only shot to end this deathmatch. With a razor-sharp swing, demonic blood sprayed into the air. Colin had successfully severed one of the High Demon's arms, leaving the monster in a state of absolute horror. The demon gritted his fangs against the searing pain, his face twisting in utter humiliation at being mutilated by a human. He roared in agony as dark red blood gushed from his stump. Colin maintained his combat stance, though the sword in his hands began to violently tremble from the mana overload. The demon, his face twisted in pure hatred, demanded to know what kind of forbidden trick the human was using. Suddenly, a grotesque smirk crept onto the demon's face. He admitted that if Colin had used this for a sneak attack, the outcome might have been different. His trademark arrogance returned in full swing as he noticed the human's rapidly deteriorating state. Right on cue, massive cracks began spiderwebbing up Colin's blade. His weapon simply couldn't handle the apocalyptic strain of the forbidden blade for another second. With a sickening asterisk crack, the blade shattered into thousands of pieces, glittering like broken crystal. Colin froze, staring blankly as his trusted weapon dissolved right before his eyes. The High Demon threw his head back and laughed, mocking Colin for failing right at the finish line. He raised his remaining hand, gathering a colossal sphere of hellfire for the finishing blow. Colin stared at the demon's arm hurtling toward him with murderous intent, the beast roaring, "Die!" Without a weapon, he was completely defenseless. A monumental pillar of fire engulfed Colin's position, vaporizing everything in its path. The sheer kinetic force of the High Demon's attack made the entire earth quake. Colin Hall lay motionless on the scorched earth, his armor completely shattered and his body covered in horrific burns. The bitter realization hit him. Even his ultimate sacrifice wasn't enough to change the ending. The demon loomed over him, proudly declaring the extinction of the human race. Colin stared up at the pitch-black sky with hollow eyes, his consciousness fading with every shallow breath. Blood dripped down from Colin's forehead, his teeth grinding together in the ultimate state of powerlessness. Every ounce of effort, every life sacrificed by his brothers in arms, amounted to absolutely nothing. Colin closed his eyes, the faces of his fallen comrades flashing through his mind. He silently begged for their forgiveness. He had failed to protect humanity's last stronghold. Using his only arm, the High Demon hoisted Colin into the air like a broken ragdoll. He wanted to savor the exact moment the life force drained from humanity's strongest warrior. In his fatting subconscious, Colin saw Marquis Darius Hall and the other fallen warriors bathed in a brilliant golden light. It was as if they were watching over him, waiting for him on the other side. The demon flashed a sadistic smile, whispering sweet mockeries about Colin's pathetic failure. He tightened his grip, ready to snuff out the fragile life of the last hero. But right at that moment, Colin's blood dripped down, landing directly on the old grimoire he always kept on him. The crimson drops seeped deep into the weathered cover, triggering a bizarre metamorphosis. The book began to pulse like a beating heart, radiating an ethereal blue light that swallowed the entire area. His blood acted as the master key, unlocking a power that had been sealed away for eons. A highly complex magic circle materialized on the book's cover, spinning wildly as ancient, glowing runes projected into the air. This energy felt light years beyond any magic this world had ever witnessed. Colin felt his body become incredibly light, as if his soul was being forcefully yanked from this reality of blood and fire. He opened his eyes, utterly confused as to why he was still conscious. Colin Hall found himself standing in an endless void, where blue light flowed around him like water. He reached for his neck, completely stunned to find his fatal wounds had vanished without a trace. In the dead silence, a deep, resonant voice echoed, calling out his name. Colin looked around, his guard instantly up, trying to pinpoint the source of this eerie voice. Colin was shocked to see a miniature black hole hovering right in front of him, emitting a strangely familiar mana. He focused his gaze, his heart hammering with a mix of intense curiosity and dread. Suddenly, Colin barked an order, demanding to know who was hiding in the dark. His warrior instincts were still razor-sharp, ready to throw down with any threat despite the surreal situation. Colin's eyes widened as tiny, brilliant white particles began gathering in the vacuum. Something absolutely extraordinary was about to unfold right in front of him. From the blinding light, the grimoire slowly materialized, floating mystically in the air. The runes on its cover blinked rhythmically, as if communicating with Colin via telepathy. Colin let out a gasp of pure disbelief. It was the magic grimoire he had kept with him all this time. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that this thing had a mind of its own and had dragged him here. The book explained that it was Colin's blood that had roused it from a millennium of slumber. It acknowledged Colin as the chosen one, drawn by his burning obsession with saving the world. The grimoire's proposal echoed directly into Colin's mind, offering to send him back in time to do it all over again. Colin's face hardened, the fire of absolute resolve reigniting in his eyes. His hands clenched into tight fists. He was ready to walk through hell if it meant rewriting humanity's tragic fate. A brand new chapter of his life was about to begin right here, right now. Colin Hall gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing with fierce hope at the thought of fixing his past mistakes. He made a silent vow. If he truly got a second chance, he would never let this tragedy repeat itself. His eyes radiated a mystical blue glow, mirroring the iron will of a man who had literally just crawled back from the gates of hell. To him, this wasn't just a miracle. It was his final shot at flipping humanity's destiny. The grimoire's pages shattered into fragments of light, fluttering around Colin like glowing butterflies. The book's voice echoed with an enigmatic tone, vowing to remain by his side and aid him from this moment forward. Colin Hall stood tall in the void, his cloak snapping in a phantom magical wind. All around him, shards of shattered time floated like haunting reminders of a broken world. The grimoire blazed at the epicenter of the vortex, forcefully downloading ancient knowledge straight into Colin's brain. It promised to help him master the most devastating magics to crush his future enemies. Colin listened to the book's whispers, his expression grim and fiercely calculating. The grimoire pledged to be his ultimate guide, the key to realizing his massive ambitions and protecting everything he held dear. A tight close-up on Colin Hall's sharp eyes revealed absolute razor-sharp focus. He was no longer the broken, dying warrior. He was a soul starving for vengeance. A mysterious silhouette gripping the violently glowing grimoire braced itself for the leap backward through time. The voice from the void resonated with supreme authority, challenging Colin to forge a brand new future for this blood-soaked world. Scene cut. Butcher! Butcher! The arena shook with deafening cheers as the bloodthirsty crowd chanted the destroyer's name. A towering behemoth gripping a massive iron mace stood menacingly, waiting for his prey. Amidst the deafening roar, the young Colin Hall slowly opened his eyes, looking completely disoriented, as if he had just woken from a decade-long nightmare. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes darting with deep suspicion and high alert. Colin froze as the reality set in. He was standing in the middle of a filthy, blood-stained slave arena. In the distance, the butcher was swinging his weapon, roaring out brutal threats. Looking down at his hands, he saw he was gripping a cheap iron sword and a rotting wooden shield. Colin muttered in absolute disbelief. "A sword and a shield. Am I really back here?" The butcher suddenly charged, bringing the spiked mace down with earth-shattering force. Colin barely managed to raise his shield in time as the air shrieked around the weapon. He gritted his teeth against the bone-crushing pressure, sweat pouring down his youthful face. The humiliating, agonizing memories of his life as a slave came rushing back like a flood. Up in the stands, the aristocratic scum cheered wildly, thrilled to see the scrawny slave hadn't been splattered instantly. A noble with a monocle excitedly commentated that this was a real show, whipping the arena into a frenzy. Viscount Slaith stood there looking smug as hell, stroking his beard as he soaked in the praises. This bastard was the absolute ruler of the Rhine region, the man holding the leash on every slave down in the pit. He flashed a sinister grin, his eyes dripping with disgust for anyone beneath his social standing. To him, human lives were nothing more than poker chips to buy his entertainment and pad his wallet. Back on the blood-soaked sand, the butcher kept the pressure up, unleashing devastating swings that kicked up massive clouds of dust across the arena. Marquis Darius Hall quietly observed the slaughter from his VIP balcony, his veteran eyes missing absolutely nothing. He seemed to have already picked up on something bizarre about the young slave. Bang! Colin completely halted another lethal smash, sparks flying as iron violently met wood. He had fully processed his reality. He had successfully leaped back in time. Shock painted the butcher's face behind his cloth mask, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief at his opponent's raw strength. How the hell was a frail slave still standing after two of his strongest hits? Colin stood his ground under the giant's shadow, his mind now razor-sharp and deadly focused. He realized he had been dropped right back to the exact moment he was forced to fight as a gladiator slave. Suddenly, a vibrant blue magic circle flared to life on Colin's hand. He wondered if the mysterious grimoire from the future had permanently fused with his very soul. If that's the case, Colin's gaze instantly turned ice-cold and dripping with killing intent, a total 180 from his initial confusion. He crouched low, using the flat head of the butcher's mace as a springboard to launch himself high into the air. His movements were so fluid and blindingly fast that the audience only saw a blur. Colin swung his blade, now glowing with a vicious blue light, delivering a lethal downward slash. The sheer technical mastery of the move was leagues beyond anything a young slave should possess. The butcher looked up in pure terror, his heavy mace suddenly completely useless against the kid's terrifying speed. From this second on, I'm rewriting my own destiny, Colin roared in his mind as the steel kissed the butcher's neck. Slash, a clean, brutal arc completely decapitated the butcher, a geyser of blood erupting and painting the air crimson. The undisputed giant of the arena dropped dead in a single, flawless strike. Colin landed lightly on the sand, his sword still dripping with thick, dark blood. Behind him, the butcher's massive corpse crashed to the ground like a felled tree. A bizarre magical glyph flared deep within Colin's eyes. He swore on his life to stop the demon race from driving humanity to extinction. The entire arena went dead silent from the sheer shock, before erupting into absolute pandemonium as the slave crowd screamed in pure, unadulterated hype. Colin glanced inward at the grimoire floating brilliantly in his mind's eye. To pull off his massive ambition, he knew he had to master every single spell in that book, and fast. Looking up at the luxury boxes, Colin knew damn well that playing the slave was just stepping stone number one in his grand master plan. Every single eye was now glued to the teenager who had just pulled off the impossible, cranking the arena's tension up to a boiling point. Colin's ultimate endgame was to infiltrate the prestigious Hall family. He stared right up at Marquis Darius Hall, exuding an aura of pure, unadulterated defiance. A memory flashed, an old slave begging on his hands and knees, pleading for Colin to throw the match so the old man wouldn't be the butcher's next victim. But Colin knew the ugly truth. Viscount Slaith was just using him as a sacrificial lamb to kiss the asses of the greedy nobles. I'll use that bastard's own scheme to get myself into the Hall estate. Colin rested the bloodied sword on his shoulder, his eyes locked and loaded. He shot a look of absolute disgust up at the VIPs running the show. Quit dragging your feet. Colin's voice boomed across the sands with terrifying authority. Send out the next piece of trash. His challenge echoed into every dark corner of the Colosseum. Smash, a deafening slam echoed from Slaith's VIP booth. The Viscount was screaming his lungs out in absolute fury as his perfect script went up in flames. Slaith was trembling, his face pale as a ghost. He had just lost his star attraction and a monumental mountain of bet money. He couldn't process how his butcher got wrecked so easily. The surrounding nobles immediately started throwing shade at Slaith, pushing the Viscount closer to the edge as he was humiliated in front of his elite guests. Slaith screamed for everyone to shut up, desperately trying to save face by claiming this upset was all part of his grand design. Up high, Marquis Darius Hall maintained his stone-cold demeanor, casually asking his aide what he thought of Colin's decapitating strike. The elite guards standing beside him openly marveled at the attack, admitting it was a strike of terrifying precision and power, something even the Empire's finest would struggle to pull off. Darius allowed a slight smirk, muttering praise that this kid was the most exceptional slave the Hall family had ever laid eyes on. Right on cue, another heavily armed gladiator charged out of the gates, attempting a cowardly sneak attack on Colin from behind. Slaith flashed a greasy, sinister grin. He planned to turn Colin into a literal cash cow, milking the aristocrat's bloodlust with a gauntlet of brutal matches. Everything is proceeding exactly as I foresaw, so sit back and enjoy the show. Viscount Slaith lied through his teeth, flashing a smug smile to the VIPs. He was desperate to convince them he still held the reins. But the cold sweat pouring down his face completely sold him out. Slaith grinded his teeth, thinking, "Next round you are going to be torn to shreds, Colin." Down in the pit, Colin Hall stood triumphantly over the butcher's corpse, his sword resting casually on his shoulder. The crowd chanting his name shook the heavens, cementing a truly legendary upset. "What the hell?" Slaith gasped, his eyes bulging behind his monocle. He couldn't believe his eyes as his backup plan immediately blew up in his face. The angry mob of nobles swarmed Slaith, aggressively accusing him of rigging the bets to scam them. The VIP stands devolved into absolute chaos. Slaith shook uncontrollably, his eyes darting in sheer panic as he was backed into a corner. He frantically racked his brain, wondering what the hell this slave was really plotting. "Hey, get every single gladiator out there, now!" He screamed like a madman, ordering a mass execution to salvage his ruined reputation. Viscount Slaith stood there, his face twisted in pure hatred, glaring down at the arena where death was supposedly waiting. Meanwhile, Marquis Darius Hall and another noble watched in silence, thoroughly entertained by the escalating chaos. An elite squad of gladiators, armed to the teeth with spears and swords, marched out onto the sands. The clanking of armor and heavy footsteps created a suffocatingly oppressive atmosphere. Surrounded, Colin closed his eyes and thought back to his past life, remembering how Marquis Darius had dedicated his entire existence to fighting for a just world. It was a hope the Marquis had entrusted to him. Colin stood entirely alone in the massive arena, encircled by 6 cold-blooded killers slowly closing the net. He knew that merely surviving this wouldn't be enough to impress the Hall family. His eyes turned razor-sharp. This was his one-way ticket out of this slave hellhole. "With my current strength, I'm going to absolutely crush this." "Come at me all at once." Colin's arrogant provocation sent shockwaves through the arena. He just stood there, casually inviting a full-frontal assault. The audience's jaws hit the floor. Some screamed that the slave had completely lost his damn mind. A tidal wave of chaotic noise washed over the Colosseum. Not keeping him waiting, the kill squad roared in unison and rushed him from every angle, radiating pure bloodlust. Spear tips locked dead onto Colin's vital spots. Colin remained terrifyingly calm, his eyes tracking every microscopic twitch of his enemies. He took a deep breath, winding up for a spectacular counterslaughter. Clang, one brute brought a heavy broadsword down with all his might, only to smash into thin air. Colin had vanished from their line of sight in a fraction of a second, leaving them totally panicked. "He dodged it," one of them yelled in sheer panic. High above them, Colin had vaulted over their heads, his blade exuding a bone-chilling aura. Suspended in midair, Colin looked down at the hunters who had just become the prey. He swore to completely rewrite his tragic fate right here, right now. Slash, a flurry of impossibly precise strikes decapitated 3 gladiators in an instant, geysers of blood painting the sand. Colin weaved through the mob like a literal ghost. He landed flawlessly, his eyes never leaving the surviving trash. Every single movement Colin made screamed of a true swordmaster's finesse. As he spun around, Colin's ice-cold gaze locked onto 2 gladiators gripping their spears. But instead of finding an opening, they were hit by a glare so full of killing intent it froze the blood in their veins. Without missing a beat, he hooked his toe under the butcher's discarded spiked mace, his thigh muscles compressing like a coiled steel spring. With flawless timing, Colin pivoted, ready to launch the heavy iron directly into their faces. Smash, the mace slammed brutally into the 2 clueless fighters, the kinetic force so overwhelming it crumpled their iron armor. Blood exploded everywhere as they were utterly destroyed by the impossible counter. With blood raining down, the 2 obstacles collapsed instantly, sending the crowd into absolute hysterics. While the arena lost its mind, a foot quietly stepped up right behind Colin. A massive gladiator swung a giant buster sword down with crushing force, but Colin merely tilted his body, dodging it by a hair's breadth. Colin's eyes flashed with that eerie blue light. He was reading the enemy like an open book. His supernatural calmness sent shivers of pure terror down his opponent's spines. He tightened his grip on his sword, winding up for a devastating counter. Colin wasn't about to give these bastards a single second to breathe. Slash, one clean, brutal swing executed the last man standing. The blade tore straight through his chest with terrifying speed and raw power. But he wasn't done. The bloodied sword launched straight up toward the VIP booth like a black thunderbolt. The wind howled around the insanely powerful throw. The lethal projectile ripped across the sky, skimming right over the audience's heads at breakneck speed. Screams died in their throats. They could only stare in pure, unadulterated horror. Up in the luxury box, Viscount Slaith was frozen solid. His eyes glazed over as his brain failed to process reality. He panicked wildly as the blade homed in right on his face. Whoosh, the razor-sharp steel grazed Slaith's cheek by millimeters, burying itself deep into the stone wall behind him and spiderwebbing the rock. Slaith's heart stopped, cold sweat drenching his entire body. The shattered stone wall was brutal proof of the monstrous power behind Colin's throw. Slaith trembled, completely speechless, face to face with the total collapse of his fake authority. A close-up of Slaith's face showed pure, undiluted terror, his eyes rolling back as if he had just looked the Grim Reaper in the eyes. Down in the pit, Colin casually retracted his stance with a razor-sharp pivot. His face was stone-cold and totally fearless, radiating the overwhelming aura of an undefeated warlord that made everyone shudder. Colin let out a faint smirk, a smile packed with arrogance and dark secrets. He knew his crusade for vengeance and world domination had only just begun. High above, Viscount Slaith ground his teeth hard enough to crack them, his bloodshot eyes burning with humiliated rage. He screamed internally that he would make Colin pay the ultimate price for this disrespect. Viscount Slaith ranted like a lunatic, pointing a shaking finger at the sword still vibrating in the arena wall. Marquis Darius Hall remained perfectly silent, while Slaith completely lost his mind over his ruined master plan. Slaith demanded the immediate execution of the slave, for daring to bare his fangs at the nobility right to his face. Hearing the word execution, Colin snapped his gaze up to the VIP box, his eyes burning with absolute hostility. Standing tall in the blood-soaked sand, he casually fired back, asking if looking down on everyone else was just a genetic trait among nobles. The aristocrats broke into a nervous sweat, suddenly feeling very unsafe in the face of this slave's unprecedented sheer audacity. Viscount Slaith slammed his scepter into the floor, his face contorted in rage at what he deemed blasphemous words. A sickly green magical aura began condensing in the palm of his hand. He started preaching about the ancient past, rambling about how God gifted magic to their ancestors, creating an absolute class divide. Flexing his mana, Viscount Slaith loudly proclaimed that the nobles were the chosen representatives of the divine. He pointed his scepter right at Marquis Darius Hall, demanding to know if the Marquis truly intended to defy the will of God. Down in the dirt, Colin simply let out a cocky, ice-cold scoff. The crowd began to buzz when Colin clapped back, asking exactly what was so sinful about his own existence. He casually plopped down onto the sand, looking entirely unbothered, while the nobles above shrieked for the guards to arrest this insolent trash. Colin suddenly shot to his feet, aimed his sword straight at Viscount Slaith, and dared the representative of God to come down and fight him one-on-one. Slaith froze, his eyes popping wide behind his monocle at the utterly insane challenge from a filthy slave. Murmurs swept through the Colosseum. Everyone assumed Colin had suffered a total psychotic break and started praying he wouldn't be slaughtered too quickly. The other nobles in the stands just laughed, treating Colin's stunt like a pathetic, suicidal joke. Marquis Darius Hall kept his mouth shut, his eyes glued to Colin as if watching a highly entertaining puzzle put itself together. Viscount Slaith marched down to the arena floor, his boots stomping heavily on the sand as he closed in on the lowly slave. He raged like a madman, screaming that Colin had destroyed his plans and dared to mock the gods in front of the entire city. Viscount Slaith began his incantation, violently swirling mana whipping around him while Colin just stood there, looking profoundly bored. Suddenly, the blue magic circle flared in Colin's eye, booting up the hidden power of the grimoire. A status screen popped up, exposing that Viscount Slaith was actually just a pathetic, beginner-level wind mage. Slaith flashed a wicked grin, announcing he was going to send Colin to hell since the kid was begging for death. Colin didn't twitch a muscle, watching the magical wind blades whip up into a violent storm around him. A massive green tornado erupted from Slaith's hands, ripping up sand, debris, and everything else in the center of the arena. Marquis Darius Hall stared into the eye of the storm, immediately identifying the spell as the Wind Blade technique. The crowd excitedly gossiped about the spell's destructive power, with some degenerates even taking bets on how many pieces Colin would be chopped into. Razor-sharp wind blades spun like buzzsaws, completely filling the space and locking onto their target. Slaith screamed for Darius to watch closely and witness the absolute, unbridgeable gap in power between a noble and a slave. Colin stood dead center in the hurricane. His shirt was shredded to ribbons by the wind blades, but his body didn't budge an inch. Another system prompt flashed, revealing Colin's true hidden stat. His swordsmanship was actually at the Grandmaster level. Colin realized that despite the flashy VFX, this was just a garbage-tier spell that couldn't even scratch him. He smiled to himself, silently thanking the grimoire for letting its cheat-like powers kick in this early. He stood unfazed inside the blender of wind, his body completely uninjured despite his clothes being torn to shreds. To Colin, this level of magic was an absolute joke compared to the horrors he fought in his past life. Viscount Slaith's jaw hit the floor. He couldn't process how his ultimate signature move didn't leave a single paper cut on his opponent's skin. Darius and the surrounding nobles were equally stunned, their faces painted with extreme, absolute shock. Colin suddenly shot forward like a bullet, tearing through the last wind blades with terrifying speed. Viscount Slaith shrieked in panic that this was impossible, as the slave materialized right in front of his face. Driven by pure, absolute despair, Slaith frantically drew the sword at his hip with violently shaking hands. Colin casually swung his blade, perfectly parrying the attack and disarming Slaith, sending the sword flying with a deafening screech of metal. Viscount Slaith's eyes practically bulged out of his skull, sweating bullets, as he realized his attack was a total joke. Colin's razor-sharp blade was now resting gently against Slaith's throat, forcing the noble to let out a pathetic, helpless whimper. In the center of the massive arena, Colin was in absolute control, pointing his sword down at the sniveling noble kneeling at his feet. Suddenly, the system blared a warning about a massive mana spike. Colin froze, his eyes darting with high alert. A sickly purple magic circle materialized right under his feet, thick black smoke instantly flooding the arena. Disgusting, skeletal purple arms erupted from the dirt, locking onto Colin's legs in a death grip. Colin gasped as dozens of phantom hands crawled up his body, locking every single joint and paralyzing him completely. They rapidly coiled around his neck and torso, violently crushing his last attempts to break free. A frigid voice echoed, announcing that the guards had arrived to handle the emergency report. The divine guards marched in wearing pristine elite armor, while the purple glyphs kept detonating around Colin. They loudly proclaimed they were arresting the suspect in the name of God, while the magical hands continued to choke Colin's face. Colin gritted his teeth against the crushing pressure as the skeletal purple fingers dug into his skull. The captain of the guard stood like a fortress, gripping a massive broadsword, radiating the terrifying authority of the divine guards. Behind him loomed the colossal magic tower, the shadowy syndicate built to enforce the absolute supremacy of noble blood. This army was packed with the most elite aristocrats, boasting firepower that made standard nobles look like jokes. Colin flexed his muscles against the dark magical chains. He knew damn well he could shatter them in a heartbeat. But he caught himself, realizing that flexing his true power now would draw away too much heat from the higher-ups. A calculating glint flashed in Colin's eyes. He decided to pull a wildly reckless and unpredictable wildcard move. Taking a massive breath, Colin readied himself for the biggest gamble of his life, all or nothing. He screamed at the top of his lungs, declaring that he was the biological son of Marquis Darius Hall, and ordered the guards to release him instantly. The bombshell statement made the guards freeze in their tracks, exchanging highly skeptical looks over the slave's insane claim. Viscount Slaith, standing right there, dropped his jaw in sheer disbelief. He couldn't believe his ears when he heard the name Colin Hall. The audience erupted into a frenzy of gossip, since nobody had ever heard a whisper about Marquis Darius having a bastard son. Colin stared down the guards, knowing full well the absolute golden rule. Divine guards were strictly forbidden from touching nobility. He quietly monitored the crowd's reaction, wondering exactly how this destined gamble was going to play out. Viscount Slaith exploded in rage, screaming that Colin was just spinning a pathetic lie to save his own worthless hide. He lunged forward with his sword, roaring that Colin deserved to die 10,000 times for daring to fake noble blood. A booming "stop" echoed from behind, carrying so much authority it froze Slaith dead in his tracks. Marquis Darius Hall strode forward, radiating absolute dominance, his piercing gaze locked dead center on the arena. Viscount Slaith frantically tried to explain himself to Darius, pointing at Colin and stuttering that he was just trying to execute this disrespectful trash. Darius suddenly lunged and backhanded Colin brutally across the face, roaring at him for being a moron and dragging the family name through the mud. The guards and the crowd were completely shell-shocked by the violent act and Darius's implicit confirmation of the boy's identity. Viscount Slaith stood totally paralyzed, sweating profusely as his brain blue screen trying to process what was happening. Darius grabbed Colin by the throat with his armored gauntlet, putting on a masterclass performance of a severely pissed-off father. He snarled right in Colin's face, raining down heavy verbal abuse for his complete refusal to repent. The Marquis tore into Colin for having the absolute gall to lay hands on Viscount Slaith instead of fixing his garbage attitude. Colin looked his father dead in the eye, internally celebrating that his insane gamble was paying out exactly as planned. A subtle flash of understanding crossed Darius's eyes. Colin smirked inwardly, knowing he had secured the bag. Keeping Colin in a chokehold, Darius pivoted toward Viscount Slaith to execute Phase 2 of his impromptu plan. Viscount Slaith trembled as Darius formally apologized on behalf of his idiot son for the massive disrespect. Colin kept up the act flawlessly, screaming back that the old bastard was the one who insulted his father first. Darius snapped, ordering everyone to shut the hell up, his eyes practically shooting fire as he glared at the crowd. He announced he would discipline this stupid brat himself, shooting a loaded glance at the frozen captain of the Divine Guards. With a highly authoritative wave of his hand, Marquis Darius Hall ordered every single person left to clear the area immediately. Viscount Slaith screamed in absolute protest, insisting Darius had no right to just walk away with the slave like that. Raising his sword high, Slaith vowed he wouldn't let anyone steal this slave and accused the whole thing of being a pathetic farce. Colin stood perfectly still, sweat rolling down his cheek as he watched Slaith's temper go critical. Slaith's eyes were practically bulging out of his monocle. He swore to murder Colin right then and there, consequences be damned. Completely ignoring all logic, Slaith charged blindly forward with his sword, totally disregarding Darius and the elite guards. A faint smirk crept onto Colin's lips. He had completely read the opponent's reckless tilt. Colin glared back at Slaith with absolute defiance, challenging whether the old fool was really going to attack the Marquis standing right in front of him. Darius Hall stood like an immovable mountain, the crushing aura of a Marquis making the very air feel toxic to breathe. Colin kept pouring gas on the fire, asking if Slaith really had the balls to attack the Divine Guards, the literal enforcers of God. Colin smirked, sarcastically asking Slaith if he was trying to kick off a full-blown treasonous rebellion. Slaith's face drained of all color, grinding his teeth in absolute rage as he realized he had walked right into the slave's verbal trap. Panicking, Slaith dropped his sword. It clattered loudly on the dirt as he frantically denied any treasonous intent. The captain of the Divine Guards casually snapped his fingers, and the purple magical hands binding Colin instantly dissolved. He formally declared the entire incident a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding, while Colin stood there looking totally unbothered. The captain bowed, apologizing for his earlier aggression, and announced the immediate withdrawal of the Divine Guards. The captain turned on his heel and walked off, leaving Darius and Slaith locked in a stare-down in the middle of the arena. He shot Slaith one final, icy glare, stating he would be submitting a full, detailed report of this mess to the Magic Tower. Viscount Slaith stood rooted to the spot, looking absolutely sick, while the captain gave a cold farewell and dipped. Colin took a massive breath, touching his chest to feel his heart rate finally slow down after that psychotic gamble. The captain and his squad marched out of the arena, but he couldn't get the name Colin out of his head. He made a mental note to write a highly detailed report on Marquis Darius Hall's sudden bastard son. Walking down the castle corridor, the captain obsessed over how the Marquis could have kept a son a secret from the entire world. He narrowed his eyes, deeply suspicious. His gut told him the kid named Colin was absolutely not the Marquis's blood. The guards murmured among themselves about how Colin didn't even flinch when hit with a high-tier binding spell. The captain ordered his men to put Colin under 24/7 surveillance and report every single breath the kid took. The squad barked, "Yes, sir," in unison, their heavy boots echoing down the seemingly endless castle hallway. The luxurious Hall family carriage glided down the dirt road, cutting through deep green forests under an overcast sky. Inside, Marquis Darius's booming laughter shattered the heavy silence that had filled the cabin. Darius showered Colin with praise for his god-tier acting, his eyes dancing with genuine amusement and satisfaction. Colin sat across from him, keeping his usual stoic poker face while the Marquis and his aide sat on the other side. He formally thanked Darius for bailing him out of that fatal bottleneck back at the arena. Colin mentally reviewed the next phase of his master plan, right after Darius ordered the butler, Cornell, to buy out his slave contract. Darius Hall crossed his arms and suddenly interrogated Colin, asking if he had ever seen real combat outside the arena. He pointed out that Colin's footwork was the exact muscle memory of a hardcore, battle-hardened veteran. Darius tilted his head, intensely curious, wondering if Colin had secretly trained under a legendary martial arts master. Colin spun a story about being born in a slum village and sold to the slave guild after his parents died when he was a kid. In Darius's mind's eye, an image formed of Colin kneeling before a mysterious noble shrouded in fog. Colin claimed that mysterious noble treated him like a real father, teaching him the absolute basics of magic and combat. He looked down at his hands, saying the man had bet everything on him but didn't live to see the payoff. Colin's eyes grew intense, vowing that this time he would absolutely live up to the massive expectations placed on him. Sitting opposite, Marquis Darius Hall listened with a stone-cold expression, his gloved hands steepled in deep thought. Darius wondered if Slaith's attacks bounced off because Colin had actually mastered the fundamentals of magic. He saw an iron will in this kid, a fire of hope that wouldn't die no matter how bad things got. A tight close-up on Darius's razor-sharp eyes showed he saw the completely unshakable resolve burning in the young man's mind. Darius pictured Colin standing tall among the guards, secretly hoping this kid was the one to turn his grand ideals into reality. The Marquis stared intensely at Colin with an unreadable expression, his brain running simulations on what this kid could bring to the table. The crunching of carriage wheels on gravel started to slow down as they approached their destination. Darius glanced out the window. The ride was over. Screech, the massive wooden wheels ground to a halt, echoing sharply in the dead silence of the estate. The carriage parked in front of an absurdly massive and gorgeous mansion, a pure flex of the Hall family's insane wealth and power. An announcement rang out, "We have arrived." A wide shot revealed the dazzling Hall estate bathing in sunlight, complete with over-the-top manicured gardens and a sparkling fountain. Darius stepped out first, glancing over his shoulder and ordering Colin to follow him inside. Colin pulled back the carriage curtain, his eyes widening slightly when Darius formally declared that as of right now, he was no longer a slave. But Darius immediately hit him with a reality check. Freedom didn't mean a safe, cozy life. Colin stood by the carriage, watching the powerful Marquis walk toward the massive front doors. Colin's face turned ice cold as he permanently engraved Darius's words into his brain. Survival of the fittest is the absolute law of this world. Darius walked with overwhelming swagger, his cape billowing, stating that his charity toward Colin ended right here, right now. He looked back at Colin one last time, making it crystal clear that surviving the coming bloodbath was 100% on him. Colin stood tall, staring Darius dead in the eye without a single ounce of fear or hesitation. With a cryptic smirk, Darius admitted he had sky-high expectations for the chaos this kid was going to cause. Watching Darius and the butler disappear into the grand hall, Colin allowed himself a satisfied smirk. The name, Colin Hall, now carried real weight, and Phase 1 of his master plan had been executed flawlessly. The nobility was perpetually obsessed with arranged marriages to protect their pure bloodlines and magical pedigree. And the Hall family was the textbook definition of that psychotic bloodline fanaticism. A colossal, breathtaking castle stood as the ultimate monument to the power and ego of this ancient dynasty. But Marquis Darius Hall was the glitch in the system. Born to a servant mother, he had to eat dirt and endure endless disrespect. Yet through sheer, psychotic grinding and godlike combat skills, he had violently clawed his way up to Marquis. He became the legendary Lord of Ryre, a name that made people wet themselves in fear. In this specific territory, your background didn't mean jack shit. No matter how dark your past was, Darius paraded Colin right into the main hall in front of everyone. He laid down the absolute law. Around here, raw power is the only currency. Wealth, status, glory, it's all sitting on a silver platter for anyone strong enough to take it. He placed a hand on the door, swearing to hand the kid literally anything he desired. As long as he had the guts and power to prove he deserved it, Darius turned back to look at him. He ordered Colin to carve that rule into his very soul. Colin muttered it back, "Anything I want." His eyes suddenly turned razor-sharp, a completely insane scheme clicking into place in his head. He loudly announced, "Then what if I want the Lord's seat?" The question dropped like a bomb, silencing the entire hall. Even Darius was blue-screened for a few seconds by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this slave kid. Then he suddenly burst into a booming, roaring laugh that shook the pillars of the grand hall. He fired back with a massive challenge. "If you're that cocky, then try and rip it from my cold, dead hands." Colin did the math. Darius was a true, hardcore fanatic for the survival of the fittest ideology. But that exact ideology made the blood-purest nobles despise him, painting a massive target on his back for countless enemies. The sharp clack of high heels echoed as an elegant woman stepped out to intercept them. "Welcome home, my lord." Darius's eyes instantly went dead. His worst enemy wasn't out there. She was right here inside his own house. It was Katrina Williams, Darius's wife. Flanking her was the eldest son, Freed Hall. Katrina threw a sarcastic jab, saying rumors about him always spread like a wildfire the second he left the estate. Darius clapped back just as hard, stating he knew damn well he couldn't hide anything from her network. She smirked, bringing up his little clash with Viscount Slaith over some cheap piece of trash slave. Darius just stared her down, his eyes radiating extreme caution. Katrina openly bragged that she was the one who assigned spies to track his every single move. To Colin, Katrina Williams was the Queen of the Shadows, the exact person who utterly destroyed the Marquis's ideals in his past life. Even as a second wife, she hoarded an insane amount of power and was actively plotting to crown Freed as the heir. In his past life, Colin had walked right into her traps, but this time he was going to break her game. He flashed a highly cryptic smile and bowed slightly. "What an absolute honor to be welcomed by both of you." Colin loudly introduced himself as Colin Hall and swore to grind his bones to dust for the Hall family. Hearing the Hall surname, Freed instantly lost his mind, taking it as the ultimate personal insult. He aggressively got in Colin's face, screaming to know who the hell he thought he was, hijacking a noble name. Katrina couldn't hide her absolute disgust. She refused to accept a filthy slave bearing the Hall name. She coldly summoned Butler Cornell to clean up this disgusting mess. Katrina sneered that this new addition was severely lacking in basic manners and discipline. Butler Cornell bowed and took the order, his face tight with stress over the escalating standoff. Colin didn't even flinch. He just calmly tightened his grip on his sword hilt. He drew his blade, boldly stating the name was a direct gift from the Lord himself, and nobody had the right to veto it. Katrina Williams plastered on a fake, venomous smile, asking if Colin really had a death wish, defying the head of the household. Colin showed zero fear. He pointed his sword straight ahead and loudly promised. One day he would be the one running this family, and they would all bow to him. Katrina's face froze in rage, pure, unadulterated contempt flashing in her razor-sharp eyes. Her son Freed was practically seeing red, grinding his teeth loud enough to hear, furious at the slave's sheer disrespect. On the flip side, Marquis Darius looked highly entertained, a faint smirk playing on his lips at the kid's insane guts. The surrounding staff started intensely whispering, everyone completely shook by Colin's psychotic ambition to hijack the throne. What the hell is this slave babbling about? The maid's frantic gossip buzzed down the hallways. Katrina gave a polite little cough to mask her fury, closing her eyes as if physically suppressing the urge to murder him. The lines of maids and butlers were sweating buckets, terrified of the suffocating tension in the room. Colin kept his perfectly calm poker face, even adding a slight, cocky smirk just to piss them off more. Katrina let out a cold HMPH, her bright red lips pressing into a thin line of absolute disgust. She screamed, "A filthy slave dares to run his mouth, shut him up." Instantly, the estate guards drew their weapons, ready to execute her order on the spot. The rest of the staff didn't waste a second. They all took combat stances, boxing Colin in with weapons drawn. Katrina issued the kill order, "Capture that bastard!" A full-blown gang fight was about to erupt right in the lobby, as the guards and staff lunged to take Colin down. Darius's roar shattered the chaos. "Stand down!" The overwhelming command forced everyone to freeze. He declared that if Colin proved he had the power, he would gladly hand over the Lord's seat to him. Freed Hall looked like his brain just broke, screaming, "Father, what the hell are you saying?" Darius physically body-blocked for Colin, completely ignoring his son's hysterical meltdown. He glared a hole through Freed, his eyes promising severe consequences if anyone pushed this further. Seeing her husband go all in, Katrina flipped her expression, giggling softly. "Oh, well, if it's your decision, my lord, I won't object." But her eyes still glinted with toxic malice, as she dropped a massive, however. She pointed out that this massive estate was kept running by hundreds of servants, grinding 24/7. And out of those hundreds, only the absolute top-tier elites were ever granted a noble surname. The maids and butlers stood in dead silence, absorbing every venomous word from their mistress. Katrina took a step forward, challenging, "Are we really just going to hand a nobody the hall name the second he walks in?" Standing toe-to-toe with Darius, she insisted the household staff would never accept such blatant nepotism. "Then let's settle this with a test." Katrina threw down the gauntlet with a highly suspicious smirk. She turned her sights on Colin. "Prove you're actually worth something. If you fail, you get thrown out on the street per family law." Colin mentally laughed, knowing her cute little test wouldn't even make him break a sweat. Seeing Colin stay quiet, Freed got cocky again, yelling, "What's wrong? You scared now?" But Colin just flashed an arrogant grin, saying it would be totally boring if he was the only one taking the test. He demanded everyone participate, claiming he didn't want the inheritance falling to some total loser coasting on his bloodline. Colin's brutal trash talk hit a critical weakness, making Freed go absolutely nuclear since he'd never been disrespected like this before. He felt physically sick at the thought of lowering himself to compete against garbage slaves and servants. Just as Freed was about to throw a tantrum, Katrina clamped a hand on his shoulder to shut him down. She coldly scolded him, "Freed, a true noble never loses their cool. Don't let yourself get dragged into a monkey's little circus act." Katrina threw a highly racist jab at Colin. Her eyes were sharp as daggers, reminding Freed he possessed an absolute, overwhelming mana pool. Colin just stood there, hands on his hips, dripping with confidence, daring Freed to watch the show from his high horse. Pacified by his mother, Freed slipped back into his edgy persona, giving a stiff nod. "Yes, mother." A wide shot showed the Hall estate looking imposing against the blue sky. Marquis Darius Hall had officially greenlit Colin's crazy proposal, and a massive public trial was set for 1 month from now. Colin Hall casually strolled behind the old butler Cornell down a hyper-luxurious hallway. He planned to lay low as a bottom-tier servant for now, just to keep the heat off himself. Colin adjusted his uniform. This downtime was the perfect setup to quietly dissect that overpowered, mysterious grimoire he had unlocked. Old man Cornell led the way, his hands clasped behind his back looking chill, but his words were sharp as a razor. He openly admitted Colin was a genius at manipulating Marquis Darius. Cornell shot Colin a highly suspicious side-eye over his shoulder. He explained the Marquis was a slave to his grand ideals, which is exactly why the other nobles had him under constant surveillance. Cornell's eyes narrowed into slits as he drilled into Colin. He dragged up Colin's story about being adopted by a noble, aggressively probing for his true backstory. Colin kept his poker face, but a single drop of sweat betrayed the escalating pressure. Cornell kept pushing, revealing the slavers swore they bought him from some irrelevant border village. Suddenly, Cornell flicked a razor-sharp dagger from his sleeve, the steel glinting with pure murder. He bluntly stated that a prodigy like Colin showing up right when the Marquis needed an heir was way too damn convenient. A blindingly fast slash aimed straight for Colin's throat. The kid's eyes blew wide open at the old butler's absolutely lethal sneak attack. Colin barely had a microsecond to process Cornell's kill shot. The old man closed the gap, aggressively asking if Colin thought his little master plan was going entirely too well. The two were deadlocked in a hypertense standoff right in the middle of the hallway. Colin dropped the formalities, calling Cornell by his name and demanding to know what the hell this violent hazing was about. Cornell squinted at Colin, his face dead serious. He stated as a fact that slavers were elite-tier con artists and professional liars. A flashback showed a shady backroom deal between a slaver and a noble. Cornell theorized they colluded with Viscount Slaith to rig the bets on Colin's arena match. Colin flashed a cocky grin. He had clearly outsmarted the old man's logic. He hit Cornell with a counter-question. Why the hell would they let him walk away after he publicly humiliated and defied them? Cornell lowered the knife, staring at Colin in genuine shock. He realized the merchant had lied through his teeth about Colin being average, when that dodge clearly proved he was a first-class fighter. In this empire, swordsmanship and magic were strictly tiered. Silhouettes of fighters grinding in the dark flashed on screen, showing just how brutal ranking up really was. 99% of people capped out at mid-tier, and only absolute freaks ever hit first class. The nobles mostly spammed magic, leaving their sword skills sitting at garbage tier. Elite death squads like the Divine Guards required first-class skills just to apply. Images of heavily armored juggernauts flashed on screen, exuding raw, terrifying power. Cornell stared at his dagger, processing the fact that the slavers had completely played him with fake patch notes on Colin's stats. He pointed the blade right back at Colin, accusing him of being an assassin sent to tie up loose ends. The kid just nonchalantly replied that it seemed the old man finally connected the dots. Colin smiled with absolute confidence, spreading his arms wide to show he had nothing to hide. He logically pointed out that a real spy wouldn't be stupid enough to paint a target on his back by gunning for the Lord's seat. Cornell froze for a second, furrowing his brow, demanding to know what the hell the kid was actually implying with that cryptic bullshit. A top-down shot showed the two facing off on a high balcony. Colin started dropping facts. A real spy's endgame is to infiltrate the core and exploit critical vulnerabilities. Colin suddenly pointed a finger dead at Cornell. He loudly declared that if he were a spy, the absolute juiciest target to hijack would be the butler's job. Cornell flinched. My job. Cornell started sweating bullets under the kid's ruthless logic. Colin hammered it home. Controlling the butler's seat meant free access to the family's darkest, most toxic secrets. Colin stuck his hand out, offering a highly calculated alliance. He proposed a trade. He would use his servant cover to hunt down the actual rats, and in exchange, Cornell had to back his play. Cornell's face hardened as he weighed the insane proposal. He gave Colin a grim warning. Pulling this trigger meant declaring war on a massive chunk of the nobility. Colin let out a wicked psycho smirk, calling it a high-risk, high-reward run. He twisted the knife by adding that if Marquis Darius got whacked, the whole succession crisis wouldn't mean shit anyway. Cornell stared a hole through Colin, mentally logging that this kid wasn't just a tank. He was a tactical genius. He asked if Colin was truly ready to carry the crushing weight of the Lord's crown. Even though Cornell kept a straight face, internally he was freaking out because this deal was way too good to pass up. A creeping sense of dread hit him. He realized he was making a deal with a terrifyingly ambitious devil. Cornell spun around and walked away, snapping out of it by ordering Colin to follow him to his new trash-tier living quarters. Colin gave a subtle, cocky smirk and a slight nod. Everything was falling perfectly into his 4D chess master plan. The scene cut to a dilapidated, depressing shack out behind the main mansion, looking 1,000,000 times worse than the flashy front yard. Cornell and Colin stood in the massive, cobblestone courtyard of the servant quarters. The old butler told the kid to just pick whatever filthy corner he liked. An image of the arrogant Katrina Williams flashed on screen. Within the Hall family, every single servant was locked into a brutal three-tier caste system she personally designed. S-tier was the personal retainers serving Lady Katrina, the Marquis, and the young master directly. They always looked immaculate and provided flawless, high-end service. A-tier were the mid-level staff, who actually got to live and work inside the main mansion with the VIPs. Trash-tier were the low-level grunts, forced to grind out grueling physical labor like hauling wood or scrubbing toilets. These bottom feeders were exiled to this segregated shack and were strictly banned from getting anywhere near the main house without a VIP pass. Cornell held up 3 fingers, laying out the garbage benefits package. Colin's main quests were dumping trash, chopping wood, and shoveling horse shit for a pathetic 3 copper coins a day. Colin just stared at him, totally deadpan. The old butler turned and walked away, ditching Colin in front of the rotting wooden door. He threw out a final warning that it was time for Colin to learn the brutal survival mechanics of this zone. Colin's eyes turned ice gold as Cornell dropped the ultimate golden rule. Colin had to submit completely and absolutely to his senior servants. 3 senior grunts were already waiting, looking ready to start a fight the second Colin walked up. They were lounging around, completely radiating toxic, bullying energy right in the low-tier yard. The seniors looked at Colin and burst out laughing like hyenas, acting like they just scored a brand new punching bag. The red-haired punk sitting on the dirt gave him a nasty, condescending once-over. In the background, Butler Cornell strolled away without even checking his rearview mirror, throwing Colin straight to the wolves. He reiterated these were the ladies' laws, and Colin had no choice but to fall in line. Cornell's silhouette vanished down the corridor, leaving the kid totally isolated in hostile territory. The old man either genuinely believed in this toxic rule or just wanted to stress-test Colin's limits. Colin's eyes narrowed, half his face masked in sinister shadows. He muttered the phrase, absolute submission, to himself, a chillingly psycho smile creeping up his face without the bullies noticing. The kid stood perfectly still in the yard while the 3 seniors held their ground, tracking his every twitch. One of them mockingly confirmed his identity. "So this is the fresh meat, Colin." Colin suddenly flipped a switch, pressing a hand to his chest and flashing the fakest, brightest customer service smile possible. He enthusiastically greeted the seniors, begging for their guidance on the job. The 3 seniors absolutely lost it, laughing their asses off at how obedient the new guy was. The redhead squinted, repeating the name Colin with maximum disrespect and mockery. But a second later, Colin's face dropped into a terrifying, dead-eyed stare. A voice laced with heavy sarcasm echoed, reminding everyone that he was the exact same guy who just demanded the Lord's throne to the Marquis's face. The biggest, beefiest senior stomped up, jamming a finger in Colin's face to assert dominance. He bragged that he heard Colin had already picked fights with both the lady and the young master on day 1. The senior chugged a bottle of cheap booze, growling that they were going to teach him the proper way to greet his superiors. Their whole objective was to completely break the kid's spirit on his very first day. A deafening crash rang out as the senior smashed the glass bottle on the ground. Shards flew everywhere, leaving a jagged, lethal weapon in his hand, signaling a brutal beatdown was about to kick off. Brandishing the broken glass, the punk screamed at Colin to drop to his knees, slap himself in the face, and beg for guidance. He threatened to keep Colin going until they were thoroughly entertained. The senior got right in Colin's personal space, shoving a finger at his face to completely nuke his dignity. He snarled, demanding to know if Colin was deaf or just stupid. Seeing Colin completely ignore him, the thug lost his mind and violently grabbed the kid by the collar. He sneered, telling him to hurry up and do the humiliating greeting before things got really ugly. But that was his final mistake. Colin struck back with lightning speed. He snapped the senior servant's wrist backward, drawing a howl of agony as the sickening crunch of bone echoed through the dead silence. The other 2 goons froze, their jaws literally dropping as their brains failed to process the scene. They never expected the nice, new guy to counterattack with such extreme, brutal violence. Before the punk could even blink, Colin buried a devastating kick straight into his gut. The kinetic force launched the senior backward, his face totally caving in from the sheer agony. The previously arrogant senior was now eating dirt, spitting up blood, gasping for air like a dying fish. The others suddenly realized they had just picked a fight with a literal raid boss. Colin raised his hand high, looking down at the shaking losers with absolute zero empathy. He calmly announced that from this second forward, he was taking the training weights off. The kid delivered a god-tier pimp slap to the senior trying to crawl out of the wreckage. He mocked their exact greeting in a voice dripping with murder. "I look forward to your guidance, seniors." The brawl was a total one-sided slaughter as Colin unleashed a relentless combo, every strike punctuated with heavy, sarcastic trash talk. The seniors were getting absolutely dismantled, zero chance of fighting back against his busted stats. The redhead and his buddy screamed in totally useless frustration as Colin completely styled on them. The whole yard was now overflowing with extreme rage and suffocating killing intent from both sides. One senior grabbed a wooden chair, aiming to smash it over Colin's head, while the other suicidally charged in with a broken bottle. They were totally unhinged, trying to murder the kid to erase their humiliation. Colin's icy blue eyes tracked their sloppy, uncoordinated attacks. To him, their desperate flailing looked like a pathetic clown show in slow motion. The sharp ring of steel echoed as Colin quick-drew the sword from his hip in a fraction of a frame. The glint on the blade guaranteed a very bad ending for anyone stupid enough to test him. Colin effortlessly parried every single garbage attack with absolute masterclass technique. The seniors started violently shaking as they realized the astronomical skill gap between them and this rookie. Blood sprayed like a geyser as Colin's blade sliced through their defenses with surgical precision. One senior was sent flying, teeth and blood raining onto the floor in a symphony of agony. Colin vaulted into the air, dropping a highly technical axe kick straight onto an enemy's skull. His animation canceling was so smooth the grunts couldn't even track him with their eyes. The kick connected perfectly, warping the senior's face as blood and spit exploded into the air. He let out a pathetic groan before getting completely knocked out by the massive blunt force trauma. The kinetic energy launched another thug straight through a wall, generating a massive shockwave. Screams of agony echoed through the trash-tier quarters, signaling the absolute wipeout of the senior squad. A grunt collapsed to the floor, clutching his ruined, bloody face, whining in pure defeat. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that their entire squad got soloed by the new guy in 10 seconds flat. Colin's razor-sharp sword was now resting gently against the face of the defeated grunt pinned to the floor. The kid's eyes were totally devoid of humanity, radiating pure, lethal malice toward the loser. Colin loomed over him, projecting the suffocating aura of a true conqueror. He coldly asked if they were finally satisfied with his greeting yet. The servant violently trembled, his face a mess of blood and tears, stuttering out that he was extremely satisfied. The primal fear of getting executed completely overrode his previous ego trip. Colin casually rested his sword on his shoulder, statting that hearing that made his day. He had completely reset the server rules in this zone in record time. But the second Colin turned his back to leave, the senior ground his teeth in toxic rage. He glared at Colin with pure hate, calling him trash and quietly grabbing the broken glass bottle again. Burning his last HP, he lunged right at Colin's back with the jagged glass, attempting a cheap shot critical hit. He screamed, "Die!" in a totally pathetic, desperate bid to reclaim his shredded ego. Colin's eyes flicked backward. His radar had locked onto this idiot's killing intent miles away. His patience for this stubborn trash had officially hit zero. With an insanely fast pivot, Colin swung his sword in a lethal silver arc directly at the incoming arm. The blade broke the sound barrier, slicing right through the attacker's final hope. A horrific scene unfolded as the servant's hand was cleanly amputated, blood erupting like a fountain into the air. The broken glass and the severed hand hit the floor, plunging the quarters into a terrifying, dead silence. The senior stared at his freshly amputated stump, shrieking in absolute, mind-bending agony over his missing limb. Colin quietly sheathed his sword, his face totally blank like nothing happened, officially ending the mutiny. Colin looked down with eyes like glaciers. He didn't even flinch at the bloodbath he just caused. The kid dropped a sarcastic one-liner, asking if amputating a limb was finally enough to make them satisfied. His highly calculated brutality served as a massive red flag to anyone else thinking of stepping up. Colin thought to himself that he had secured Butler Cornell's trust for now. but he knew damn well the upcoming raid wasn't going to be a walk in the park. His eyes flashed with that intense blue mana as he prepped to crack open the grimoire and kick off his magic grinding session. A colossal wave of energy exploded when Colin opened the book. He swore to himself he had to master this to survive the coming war. A flashback rolled of the estate's politics. When Lady Katrina Williams married in, she instantly purged the staff and installed her own cronies. Her already toxic relationship with the Marquis went nuclear when she enforced that brutal caste system. To counter her, Cornell, the Marquis's ultimate ride-or-die, was installed as butler to hard-nerf her influence. He had enough admin privileges to ban Katrina's loyalists from the estate. Cornell wasn't just a glorified bouncer. He held the ultimate veto power over who got named the heir. Nobody was climbing onto that throne without his stamp of approval. But in his past life, Cornell's brutal murder was the exact catalyst that kicked off the apocalypse, sending everything straight to hell. Capitalizing on the chaos, Lady Katrina blitzed the power vacuum and installed her son Freed as the heir. The entire estate fell under her absolute, tyrannical dictatorship. Back in the present, Colin was sweating buckets floating amidst the glowing pages, realizing his magic resistance was way too garbage right now to solo the major factions. Colin's hands traced the glowing ancient text. He was desperately hunting for a hybrid spell that gave him both massive DPS and tank stats. The second his fingers brushed a violently glowing page, a massive shockwave blasted him backward, shaking the entire room like an earthquake. The grimoire's data started forcefully downloading straight into Colin's brain, the agonizing pain making him bite his tongue to stop from screaming. Colin's body locked up, crackling with dark magic lightning. It felt like a million fire ants were eating him alive. His bones and soul felt like they were being submerged in boiling lava. Inside the magic hallucination, a ridiculously overpowered Black Knight materialized from thick purple fog. Colin reached out, trying to hack the system and hijack its power. The iron armor's eyes flashed with a freezing blue light, glaring at the arrogant kid trying to tame it. The raw killing intent made the air around Colin feel like wet cement. The Dark Knight swung a massive greatsword, while whispers of destroy and submit aggressively spammed Colin's mind. He screamed in pure agony, fighting off the dark mana trying to completely overwrite his save file. Colin's face twisted from the strain, wondering if this was the insane pay-to-win cost for unlocking high-tier magic. He felt his HP bar rapidly dropping towards 0. Suddenly, a memory triggered of a mysterious blonde woman. She gently told him to close his eyes and sync up with the natural flow of mana. Colin realized the total bullshit RNG of this world. Nobles breathed magic effortlessly, while he had to fight a literal Dark Souls boss just to learn a spell. He wondered if the Bloodline meta was really that broken. But instead of rage-quitting, Colin's eyes burned with psycho hype. The harder the boss, the more he wanted to absolutely style on it. He slammed his hand onto the page, blue lightning exploding violently as he burned his ultimate to finally tame the spell. The mana slowly began bending to his admin commands. The massive shadow entity engulfed Colin, flooding the room with blue light as he roared his lungs out to finish the sync process. The overpowered buff was finally his. No matter what the devs threw at him, Colin absolutely refused to take an L here. He ground his teeth, tanking the final ticks of damage wrecking his body. His roar shook the Hall estate in the dead of night, announcing the massive level up of the underdog. A blinding beam of light shot out of his bedroom window. At the crack of dawn, the estate grunts were already grinding out the laundry raid by the giant wooden tubs. The splashing water cut through the quiet morning vibes. Two servants flinched, snapping their heads back when they heard footsteps rolling up. One of them actually gasped in shock. A pair of boots strolled up with max swagger. It was Colin, looking completely unbothered despite pulling an insane all-nighter training session. Colin stepped into the yard looking bored out of his mind, stretching and joking that he was fully expecting the seniors to try and gank him in his sleep. The grunts just stared at him, totally intimidated and annoyed. He let out a cocky smirk as he walked past. He knew their stats were way too low to even scratch his armor anyway. Colin's massive ego just pissed everyone off even more. Colin popped open his status menu. He had officially unlocked the unique spell Eternity and bumped his sword skill to Grandmaster tier. His magic resistance stat was finally starting to scale up too. A smug grin crossed Colin's face, knowing his speedrun strat was working flawlessly. This raw power was the exact foundation he needed to break the current meta. He laughed out loud, rubbing his neck, suddenly realizing his stamina bar was completely depleted after burning so much mana. He needed to find an HP potion or some food ASAP. But the chill morning vibes were instantly ruined by someone screaming at everyone to get the hell out of the way. A heavily armed squad was marching aggressively into the servant zone. The two laundry grunts froze, staring at the incoming guard patrol in sheer panic. They nervously whispered about why the hell the guards were suddenly spawning here. Leading the pack was Lieutenant Eyepatch, a totally unhinged officer rocking a nasty scar and an eye patch. He barked at the grunts to bow down immediately if they didn't want to get executed on the spot. A young servant carrying a massive tub of water started shaking violently, sweating bullets as the patrol marched right at him. He desperately tried to balance the heavy tub while the officer stared him down. Freaking out, the kid completely fumbled and bumped right into the patrol. He froze in horror, knowing he was about to get a massive penalty. Smash, a guard charged in and Spartan kicked the kid right in the chest, sending him flying and screaming in pain. The guard roared, tearing into the kid for blocking their path and ruining their march. The wooden tub rolled across the dirt, spilling water everywhere and absolutely ruining the officer's pristine black boots. Muddy water splashed all over Lieutenant Eyepatch's legs. Lieutenant Eyepatch stopped dead, staring down at his ruined boots with a freezing, murderous glare. His dead silence was infinitely more terrifying than any screaming. Another guard lost his mind, screaming at the servant for daring to disrespect the officer's gear. He waved his arms around like a lunatic, while the lieutenant maintained a psycho, deadpan stare. The poor servant groveled in the dirt, aggressively begging for his life in absolute terror. Lieutenant Eyepatch towered over him like a raid boss, projecting an aura of pure death onto the helpless NPC. Lieutenant Eyepatch played the nice guy, placing a hand on the shaking servant's shoulder. He chuckled, saying it was a real problem if those eyes couldn't stay focused on the job. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his smile twisting into something straight out of a horror movie. The servant just kept his head down, sweating oceans, absolutely paralyzed by the officer's killing intent. However, the officer paused, his eyes turning ice cold, winding up to make a brutal, bloody example out of the kid. With zero hesitation, Lieutenant Eyepatch jammed 2 fingers straight into the poor servant's eyes right in front of the whole lobby. He coldly stated that eyes that couldn't look in the right place didn't deserve to exist. A blood-curdling scream tore through the estate as blood splattered all over the officer's hands and face. The brutal reflection in the shadows made the whole scene feel suffocatingly dark and psychotic. The other servants were completely blue-screened, shaking as they watched their coworker get tortured without daring to intervene. They mentally prayed they wouldn't pull aggro from these absolute psychos. Another guard with a massive scar started screaming at the stunned servants. He roared, asking what the hell they were looking at and ordered them to get back to the grind instantly. He demanded everyone drop to their knees to show absolute loyalty to the Hall family's military. The servants frantically complied, eating dirt, not a single one daring to complain. Watching from a distance, Colin casually observed the entire torture scene without batting an eye. Honestly, he was more focused on planning his breakfast menu after a long night of grinding. The cowardly blonde servant, the exact same guy Colin had styled on earlier, suddenly shrieked and pointed right at him. He called the officer boss with a face full of toxic hate, begging for someone to carry his revenge. He snitched, screaming that Colin was the maniac who chopped off his hand, and warned the lieutenant to watch out for this total psycho. He claimed Colin was literally insane for muttering to himself in the middle of the night. Lieutenant Eyepatch narrowed his one good eye, shifting his entire murderous aggro onto Colin, the random nobody daring to ignore the estate's rules. The officer barked an order, demanding Colin step up and take his punishment like a man. The kneeling servants violently scrambled out of the way, keeping their heads down to avoid the splash damage. Colin casually turned around, looking completely bored, showing absolutely zero fear of the armed guards trying to box him in. He actually let out a slight smirk seeing the blonde snitch's crew had spawned too. Lieutenant Eyepatch licked the blood off his hand with a creepy-ass smile to try and break Colin's mental. He warned he wasn't as soft as the VIPs and would happily chop off Colin's hands if he kept up the edgy attitude. The guards drew their swords, fully surrounding Colin to pressure him into kneeling. They laughed, asking if he wanted to chop his own hands off or if they should help him do it the hard way. Colin stayed completely unfazed, his hand slowly resting on his sword hilt. A massive, invisible wave of killing intent started leaking out of the teenager. He flashed a totally disrespectful smirk, giving the guards an ultimatum: keep their hands or keep their heads if they dared to step even 1 pixel closer. Colin's grip tightened on the hilt, ready to quick-draw at supersonic speed if these NPCs kept pushing his aggro range. His ice-gold stare locked dead onto Lieutenant Eyepatch, repeating the question and making the officer actually flinch from the sheer pressure. Colin's confidence wasn't just him acting tough. The officer scoffed, convincing himself Colin was just bluffing to hide his fear. He took a step back, declaring he was way too high-level to waste time on a noob like him. Lieutenant Eyepatch announced he was tagging in a proxy to handle the trash. The guards parted like the Red Sea, making way for an absolute unit of a man. Colin narrowed his eyes, analyzing the new challenger's gait. He instantly realized this guy had base physical stats light years ahead of the standard guard mobs. A massive, shredded dude with silver hair and a body covered in battle scars stepped up. It was Daku. The officer hyped him up as the former arena champion, a literal killing machine hard-coded to obey orders. Colin stared right at Daku, instantly accessing his past life database on this specific fighter. He knew for a fact Daku was a combat prodigy whose mental had been completely broken. Flashbacks of Daku acting as an absolute vanguard on the battlefield played in Colin's mind. The guy used to be a fearless berserker, always diving headfirst into the highest threat zones. Colin internally cringed seeing top-tier SSR units like Daku reduced to literal pawns in the nobles' toxic political games. The elites treated legends like him worse than dog shit. An ironic image flashed of Daku and his squad raiding massive boss monsters just to protect the noble bloodlines. Despite his god-tier stats, he was completely nerfed by his slave mentality and brainwashed loyalty to the divine blood. Colin checked out the fresh, bleeding wounds on Daku's body and commented that the guy literally just got brutally ganked by his own team minutes ago. He found the blind loyalty of this absolute beast completely pathetic. Colin unsheathed his sword, the steel flashing in the sunlight. He straight up asked Daku if he really wanted to keep tanking hits and bleeding out for players who treated him worse than a dog. He broke down the server's toxic mechanics, mid-tiers kissing up to the admins, and noobs forced to blindly obey the seniors. The nobles abused these rules to permanently ban high-stat players who lacked the guts to rebel. Colin's eyes flared with intense blue mana as he interrogated Daku on why he let himself be used as a DPS bot without ever demanding basic human rights. He was aggressively trying to talk no jutsu the slave programming out of the champion. Colin smirked. He had successfully proxed a tiny but obvious flinch in Daku's eyes by directly attacking his shredded ego. Daku flexed his massive muscles, charging up his attack animation out of pure habit, but his eyes were internally screaming. He still couldn't break the hard-coded rules deeply installed in his brain. The cowardly blonde servant hid behind the guards, a toxic grin plastered on his face, eagerly waiting to watch Daku combo Colin into red mist. Suddenly, Lieutenant Eyepatch's face went completely pale as his radar picked up an apocalyptic power level exploding out of Colin, entirely shattering his logic of what a slave could do. With Grandmaster speed, Colin instantly teleported directly behind Lieutenant Eyepatch. He held his blade to the officer's throat, whispering that he was going to completely nuke the garbage rules the nobles had built. The surrounding guards completely lost their minds, panicking because their frames literally couldn't keep up with Colin's movement skill. The suffocating speed diff completely paralyzed the zone. Daku stood completely blue-screened in the middle of the yard. His radar completely lost track of the target in a single frame, despite his passive tracking skills. The former champion's face was painted with absolute shock. Daku realized with absolute horror that his equipped sword was just gone. The kid standing behind the officer was now casually holding the champion's own weapon like it was nothing. Lieutenant Eyepatch, was shaking like a leaf sweating oceans as he felt the cold steel clipping into his hitbox. He desperately tried to flex his authority, screaming to know if Colin realized which guild he was messing with. The officer shrieked that he was a direct subordinate personally handpicked by Freed Hall, the so-called divine emissary. An image of the arrogant, red-haired noble Freed flashed on screen, the true final boss of this toxic hierarchy. Colin pressed the blade deeper into the officer's neck, forcing him to stare the game over screen right in the face. The officer kept spamming empty threats about how Colin was declaring war on Freed Sama and the entire estate staff. The guards were completely stun-locked, gripping their swords, but absolutely zero of them dared to pull aggro and save their boss. The tension was at max capacity because nobody could predict Colin's insane RNG. Behind the wooden barricades, the slaves and low-tier servants were shaking, watching this completely unbalanced matchup with pure horror and morbid curiosity. They had never seen an NPC rebel against the guards' admin abuse like this. Colin's face was completely stoic and razor-sharp. He wasn't even slightly debuffed by the officer's pathetic trash talk. A massive, silent conqueror's haki was radiating from the kid. Colin violently shoved Lieutenant Eyepatch away like literal trash, making the officer stumble and nearly face-plant into the dirt. The guy stared at Colin, completely mind-blown that he just got disrespected that hard. The officer clutched his burning throat, sweating buckets from pure humiliation and rage. He snarled, vowing he would never let Colin log out safely without suffering the most hardcore penalty possible. Lieutenant Eyepatch shot a highly toxic glare backward, pinging his loyal goons to execute a cheap shot to restore his damaged ego. He needed to see a health bar drop to calm down. Two guards with psychotic grins readied their weapons, pivoting to attack an easy AFK target instead of rushing Colin. They were professional bullies who only targeted low-level players to flex. Suddenly, blades flashed, and a geyser of blood erupted from Daku's bare back. A scream of pure agony echoed across the yard as the slave champion was violently backstabbed by his own faction. Colin's eyebrow twitched, witnessing the guards totally griefing their own defeated teammate. He was really starting to see the absolute bottom-tier toxicity of this estate's guild structure. Lieutenant Eyepatch started laughing like an absolute maniac. He wanted to teach this trash Daku a brutal lesson about failing a quest before he dealt with Colin. His smile was getting more and more corrupted. Daku collapsed to his knees, his back sporting a massive, gruesome X-shaped gash that looked like a fatal critical hit. Thick red blood spammed the floor, creating a massive AoE pool around the shaking warrior. A guard violently drove his sword straight into Daku's planted hand, the bone-crushing sound triggering massive damage numbers. Blood kept geysering from his back as the guard aggressively griefed the downed player. The other guard grabbed Daku by his hair, violently yanking his head back, and drove his razor-sharp blade straight through the exhausted champion's hand. The slave's eyes were totally hollowed out by pure despair and max-level pain. They aggressively spam-taunted Daku with the most toxic slurs, calling him a useless bot, and warning him that if he dropped his weapon again, they would instantly permaban him from life. The guard glared with maximum killing intent. Unable to just spectate this toxic griefing anymore, Colin suddenly dash-canceled forward like a heat-seeking missile. His insane spawn-in speed made the guard's eyes bulge. He literally couldn't input a command in time. A pair of eyes blew up to max size in pure terror as they stared directly at the Grim Reaper, reflecting Colin's blade locking onto an undodgeable hitbox. The server practically lagged out in that exact millisecond. Razor-sharp slashes tore the fabric of space, spraying guard blood everywhere as Colin instantly deleted the toxic players torturing Daku. His attack speed was so busted, it only left faint red afterimages on screen. Lieutenant Eyepatch squinted his one eye. He thought he spotted a fatal animation lock while Colin was busy peeling for Daku. A smug, toxic grin flashed across the corrupt officer's face. The officer popped his ultimate, swinging a massive backstab at Colin, screaming that a noob should never turn his back on a real PvP veteran. He was 100% convinced he just secured the kill. But Colin animation canceled perfectly, spinning around and parrying the lethal strike with his own blade. A deafening metallic clash triggered massive spark VFX as the hitboxes collided. Lieutenant Eyepatch His face warped into pure shock and terror as his ultimate was perfectly parried with zero effort. He finally realized the massive, unplayable gap in MMR between him and the kid. Colin applied a massive stat check, physically snapping the officer's blade right in his hand, sending sharp metal shards flying everywhere like a lethal bullet hell. The officer was left staring at a broken hilt in absolute disbelief. He aimed the jagged remains of his sword right at Lieutenant Eyepatch's face, coldly warning him that next time, it wouldn't be a weapon getting snapped. The officer started shaking and begging for mercy. His entire ego was completely wiped. The officer's eyes squeezed shut, projecting max-level fear as he stared at the game over screen. He was completely stun-locked by Colin's overwhelming stat diff. Colin wound up a massive, high-DPS swing aimed right at Lieutenant Eyepatch. Suddenly, Daku forced himself up despite having 1 HP and blocked the fatal hit for the corrupt officer. The swords clashed, triggering a massive audio spike. Colin's eyes burned with intense rage as he looked at his blade locked with Daku's. He was totally blue-screened by Daku peeling for the guy who literally just tortured him. What kind of insane debuff made him tank for his abuser? Suddenly, Daku burned his remaining stamina for a heavy swing, knocking Colin back and creating distance. The tricky counter didn't just break Colin's posture, it completely canceled the lethal combo. Daku tried to stay upright despite the massive bleed debuff, gripping the hilt with both hands and screaming at Colin to stop griefing the server. He was still heavily CC'd by the Hall family's absolute authority, and terrified Colin was going to get permabanned. Daku's hands violently shook on the iron hilt, dark blood dripping from his back down his arm, totally soaking the old weapon's grip. You could literally see the massive psychological debuff tearing the slave apart. Colin stopped moving, his eyes hidden by edgy shadows, giving him a totally cryptic vibe as he quietly listened to the useless warnings from the guy he just healed. He let out a highly sarcastic smirk. Colin's eyes suddenly flared with intense blue mana. He announced he was dropping aggro this one time exclusively to keep Daku from getting banned. He dropped a heavy, intimidating voice line, warning this was the absolute final warning for everyone in the zone. The guards and the pathetic servant mobs instantly rooted, fleeing the zone like panicked NPCs when they felt the apocalyptic aura leaking from the teenager. Nobody had the balls to stay in his aggro radius for another second. Colin walked up to Daku, genuinely curious why a player with such insane base stats would let a bunch of low-level, cowardly trash farm him for exp without fighting back. His question dealt massive emotional damage to the fallen champion. Daku roared in pure despair and rage, claiming Colin just triggered a massive death flag by openly aggroing an officer of the elite Hall Guild. The slave programming was basically hard-coded into the former champion's operating system. Daku tossed the sword back to Colin. It was a pathetic gesture proving his absolute, terrifying submission to his toxic guild masters. Colin casually caught Daku's hilt midair. Daku coldly stated he was transferring the weapon to him, even if it was just a cursed item that only brought bad RNG and slavery. Colin stood totally isolated among the NPCs, heavy wind effects blowing his coat and dark hair around, giving him a massive, edgy protagonist aesthetic. He was totally baffled by Daku's programming. Suddenly, Lieutenant Eyepatch went completely psycho, grabbing Daku's hair and aggressively waterboarding him in a full tub to vent his massive frustration over his L. He spammed toxic slurs, calling the slave a bot for making him look like trash in front of his squad. Daku desperately mashed buttons to break the CC underwater, bubbles spamming the surface while his eyes squeezed shut from the max-level pain and suffocation debuff. He couldn't break the high-tier officer's grapple. The psychotic officer violently yanked Daku's head out of the tub. The slave just coughed violently, whispering pathetic apologies while his dignity hit absolute zero. His face was pale from the cold debuff and pure fear, sweat and water dripping everywhere. Lieutenant Eyepatch slammed Daku's head into the dirt, ordering him to log out of his sight instantly so he didn't have to look at the guy who ruined his raid. Daku ragdolled across the hard dirt, soaked and shivering from his stacked bleed and freeze debuffs. A guard walked up to Lieutenant Eyepatch, confused, asking if the officer was really just going to let Colin walk away without catching a ban. With a highly calculated glare, the officer confirmed the questline was far from over. Lieutenant Eyepatch flashed a totally toxic smile, ordering his guildmates to spam the server chat with rumors that Colin just declared GVG war on all the high-tier retainers. He was plotting to strip Colin's rank and isolate him, turning the kid into a server-wide bounty target inside the estate. Daku stood AFK in the middle of the yard, freezing water still dripping down his completely broken face after the brutal torture session. The slave champion looked like he had completely quit against the absolute bullshit RNG of the caste system. Colin's silhouette appeared with deep, intense eyes, echoing the heavy dialogue where he asked Daku why he refused to PvP to protect his own account. The blurry reflection of the slave in the water served as a massive metaphor for the mental CC Colin was desperately trying to dispel. The scene cut to a massive, high-tier banquet, the food models looking just as insanely high-poly as the nobles' VIP zones. All the NPCs had their hands clasped, spamming prey emotes before starting the feast. They were chanting max-level praise to the supreme devs and the divine admins, begging for permanent server stability. Meanwhile, in a different instance of the estate, the maids were gossiping about getting promoted to the elite retainer tier. They totally believed their prayers were actually getting logged and dreamed about unlocking a better ending. A guard scooped a bowl of trash-tier soup, lecturing the servant mobs to stop complaining and grind harder if they wanted the devs to notice them. A massive queue of players was waiting for their garbage-tier daily rations. This was literally their only stamina recovery item. Suddenly, a random player spawned into the zone, making the queue of servants completely lose their minds in the chat. It was Colin Hall, just casually walking through the zone like he owned the entire server. Colin wondered why everyone was targeting him with their cameras, while his hand casually reached for a bowl. He was just trying to grab a standard daily ration, but he suddenly had 100% of the zone's aggro. Suddenly, the guard managing the loot drop smacked Colin's soup bowl away, toxically laughing that AFK players don't get loot. Colin completely ignored the troll, doing a 180 and walking away while the whole lobby watched in shock. He put his hands behind his head, casually walking away while the mob of servants started spamming laugh emotes at him. The entire lobby suddenly went dead silent, wondering where the hell this kid was pathing as he headed straight for the restricted zone. That was the VIP dining instance locked exclusively for high-tier retainers and admins, where low-level trash would get instant banned for entering. Colin just aggressively clipped right into the zone, spamming voice lines demanding everyone clear the path, causing massive server chaos. The elite retainers sitting at the VIP tables started mouthing, furiously demanding the mods instantly ban this arrogant slave. The admin squad held their breath watching Colin, casually loitering in front of a massive buffet of high-tier consumables. Completely ignoring the massive amount of hostile aggro, Colin grabbed a croissant and just started eating it, completely unbothered. Cornell walked up, using his serious voice to warn Colin this was a level-restricted zone, but Colin just gave a muffled "uh-huh" while chewing his food. An angry admin started screaming, demanding Cornell issue an instant permaban for this massive TOS violation. Cornell stared at Colin, his eyes running a deep background check. His face was totally unreadable and completely calm. Instead of dropping the ban hammer, Cornell just dropped a casual voice line saying bugs happen with new players and told Colin to follow his pathing. The two of them walked down the hyper-luxurious rendered hallway, pulling massive amounts of curious aggro from everyone around. Cornell asked if Colin had accidentally wiped his hard drive regarding the absolute submission rule, or if he was just intentionally griefing. Colin just gave a light smirk, acting like the massive aggro pull was a totally casual daily quest. He kept eating, casually boasting that his stats were high enough to easily farm top-tier consumables, exactly like the guild master promised. Cornell evaluated Colin, deciding he would personally sponsor the kid's daily gold upkeep, but he slapped a massive hidden quest on it. Cornell's face turned completely serious as he dropped the quest requirements. The mandatory quest objective: Colin had to track down the spy currently cloaked inside the Hall Estate server. A horn sound effect triggered the start of the hunting event. Colin stood in the distance, his face calculating the optimal route. He was deployed to the deep dark forest, instance near the hunting zone, to investigate a series of bugged spawn rates. Colin casually finished his consumable, totally ready to start grinding in the high-level poison swamp zone. He flashed a highly confident smirk as he entered the forest instance. It looked like he already had a speedrun strat mapped out. From the brush, a mob with glowing red eyes was quietly locked onto the player, invading its aggro radius. The beast casually grazed by the river, completely unaware that a high-level peaker had it in his crosshairs. It was the red-eyed black stag, a highly aggressive mob with insane movement speed stats in this biome. Before the mob could even trigger its dodge animation, Colin quick-swapped to his bow, firing arrows that broke the sound barrier with massive DPS. The arrows scored critical hits, instantly dropping the black stag's HP to 0. Blood VFX splattered all over the surrounding foliage. Colin unequipped his bow, a smug GG smile on his face as he confirmed his flawless aimbot accuracy. He exited stealth mode, drawing his short sword to start the looting animation on the down mob. Colin checked the mob, his eyes scanning for the ultra-rare drop. The black stag was clipping into the ground with arrows stuck in its hitbox, spamming its death animation audio. Its HP bar finally vanished under the ice-gold stare of the victorious hunter. Blood VFX sprayed as he started the carving animation, digging for the legendary item buried in the loot pool. Colin went into max focus mode, making sure he didn't miss a single pixel of the drop. Colin's eyes lit up when he spotted a crystal emitting a massive blue aura. He let out an excited voice line, confirming this was the exact quest item he was grinding for. It was a monster core, a premium crafting material usually used by whales to craft high-tier cosmetic jewelry. Colin held the bloody drop, already theory crafting its actual utility. Thanks to the Grimoire wiki, he knew this core could be used in alchemy to craft custom mana potions. Even though it was a low-tier mat, it was an insanely broken exploit for his current level. A system UI popped up, confirming the alchemy crafting success rate was 100%. He happily threw the core into his inventory, prepping for the next phase of his speedrun. In a quick flashback cutscene, Cornell warned Colin that only divine guards and knights had the correct access passes for this hunting instance. The toxic class division was hard-coded even into the zone restrictions. Colin just smirked, asking if partying up with a divine guard would bypass the level gate. He was an absolute master at exploiting server loopholes to get what he wanted. Back to live gameplay, Daku was absolutely freaking out seeing Colin casually PKing mobs in a restricted zone. He sprinted over, terrified of the massive ban wave that was about to hit them. Daku screamed that only nobles and mid-tier retainers had the necessary permissions to trigger the hunting minigame. He relentlessly spammed warnings about their garbage tier status in the eyes of the server admins. Colin quietly turned his head to look at his companion, who was panting heavily with anxiety. His face remained perfectly composed, as if those threats carried absolutely zero weight. He casually held out the sword, stating he was just borrowing it for a bit. Colin's nonchalant attitude left Daku completely frozen, unable to utter a single word. Daku's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, seeing how cleanly and unbelievably fast Colin had taken down the monster. Colin stood next to the stag's corpse, his face radiating absolute confidence in his own skills. Daku stared blankly at Colin, sweat pouring down his face, as his brain failed to process the young man's monstrous strength. A mix of awe and creeping terror began to take root in his chest. Blood was still oozing from the monster's corpse, impaled deep by Daku's sword. This brutal scene was absolute proof of the overwhelming power Colin had been hiding. Colin casually told Daku that this monster was now their prey. He smirked, clearly highly entertained by his companion's shell-shocked expression. Daku kept muttering complaints, arguing that Colin's logic was completely insane. He clenched his fists, feeling utterly helpless against this guy's sheer audacity. Daku felt profoundly depressed being paired up with a low-tier, completely undisciplined servant like Colin. He kept grumbling about his garbage luck while working. While Daku was busy butchering the monster's carcass, he couldn't stop wondering why Cornell had made such a bizarre call. He just couldn't figure out what was going through that powerful butler's head. Colin presented the short sword as proof, firmly stating he was on a secret mission directly from Cornell. Daku stared at the blade with a mix of deep suspicion and shock. Colin further explained that they had to assist the Lord's investigation while also scavenging for extra food. Daku could only let out a clueless huh at this massive lore drop. Colin carefully dropped the monster core into a glass vial, completely ignoring Daku's background nagging. He was laser-focused on his main objective, tuning out the useless chatter. Daku let out an exhausted sigh, silently praying he could just finish this quest in peace. His face screamed how tired he was of dealing with his eccentric partner. At their feet, rows of freshly butchered, bright red venison were lined up, looking incredibly appetizing. Daku muttered a quick prayer, hoping God would shield them from whatever bullshit was coming next. Daku stared intensely at his sword, holding onto the hope that he'd finally get promoted to a full-time member if they cleared this mission. He desperately craved a stable position in this brutal society. Suddenly, Daku froze as he spotted something completely abnormal happening right in front of him. His eyes blew wide open, filled with suspicion and panic. Colin had already built a campfire and was casually roasting massive chunks of venison. He happily waved Daku over to eat, acting like this wasn't a massive deal. Daku screamed in sheer terror seeing Colin brazenly grilling the hunted monster meat. He shrieked, asking what the hell Colin was doing, while Colin just deadpanned that he was cooking meat. He frantically reminded him that this entire food stash had to be handed over to the Lord and the VIPs. Daku couldn't believe Colin actually had the balls to steal food from their masters. Completely ignoring Daku's hysterical screaming, Colin just took a massive bite out of a steak, grease smearing his face. He mumbled that with this much meat, skimming a little off the top was no big deal. Seeing Daku still paralyzed with shock, Colin shoved a mouth-watering piece of grilled meat right in his face. He urged him to just take one bite and taste it. Daku yelped and recoiled in horror, as if he were being offered poison by a cultist. He recited the golden rule that an enemy of the stewards was an enemy of the divine guards, and he wanted zero part in this. Colin scoffed, hitting him with the brutal reality check that servants like Daku were only fed once every 3 days. He was directly targeting the most basic human survival instinct. He kept twisting the knife, asking exactly how much longer Daku thought he could survive running on an empty stomach. The rich aroma of the roasted meat was absolute psychological torture for Daku right now. Daku froze, sweating buckets as his mouth started violently watering from the incredible smell right under his nose. Colin's logic, how the hell could he protect the Lord while starving, finally started breaking his resolve. Colin flashed a highly manipulative smile, swearing he wouldn't snitch to anyone, so Daku should just eat and relax. He knew damn well this psychological trump card was about to work. Finally, base instincts completely overrode logic. Daku snatched the roasted meat and started wolfing it down like a madman. The sound of his starving, frantic chewing echoed through the quiet forest. Daku trembled as he ate, desperately gaslighting himself that he was only doing this for the mission and the Lord. Colin watched quietly, then asked Daku why a total powerhouse like him took orders from those weak, pathetic stewards. Colin's gaze turned razor-sharp as he stared Daku down, drilling right into the massive contradiction between the guy's raw strength and his trash-tier status. This question was a direct nuke to the core belief system Daku had worshipped his whole life. Daku paused for a second, meat still stuffed in his cheeks, wondering what the hell personal strength had to do with anything. In his brainwashed mind, the world order was hard-coded by bloodlines and the gods. Daku preached that the nobles' ancestors were hand-picked by God for their absolute faith, gifting them divine power. He genuinely believed that if he just kept grinding and praying, God would let him respawn into a high-tier bloodline in his next life. In a spiritual daydream, Daku envisioned the day he could stand beside his estranged little sister as a true elite bloodline member. That was literally the only hope keeping him sane through all the humiliation and oppression in this life. Daku snapped, his face twisting in genuine anger at Colin daring to challenge his religion. He aggressively told Colin to stop trolling and respect the values he had worshipped his entire life. Even though he didn't understand the Lord's obsession with bloodlines, Daku still felt blessed just to be a servant. To him, simply being allowed to work hard without thinking too much was a divine privilege. Colin let out a cocky smirk, his eyes dripping with absolute contempt at the mention of Daku's beloved, divine power. To him, it was just pathetic propaganda used to brainwash the masses and hold back humanity's true potential. Colin casually dropped the ultimate truth bomb. It all literally just boiled down to whether or not you could use magic. He looked at Daku with a dead calm stare, an insanely bold idea forming in his head. Daku fired back, daring Colin to try and learn even the most basic, garbage-tier spell if he was so damn confident. He was absolutely convinced a commoner could never even touch magic. Colin looked Daku dead in the eye and dropped an absolutely unthinkable proposal. "How about I teach you magic?" The question hit like a bomb, completely shattering Daku's core belief system. Daku froze, cold sweat pouring down his face as he realized Colin was dead serious. He honestly didn't know whether he should laugh in his face or be terrified of this psychotic offer. Under the dense forest canopy, Daku gasped in absolute shock. "You can! Use magic!" A brand new chapter in their dynamic, and Daku's entire future seemed to unlock right at this very second. Daku turned and desperately asked if Colin actually knew how to cast spells. The two of them stood in the gloomy forest, about to kick off a highly chaotic new journey. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through Gloomwood. Flocks of birds scattered into the sky in a panic, signaling that an absolute massacre was currently underway. Colin and Daku instantly snapped into high alert. Their expressions hardened, shooting razor-sharp glares toward the source of the blood-soaked noise. The scene ahead was a total horror show. A soldier had just been pinned by an azure flame wolf. Its razor-sharp fangs sank deep into his shoulder, making the grunt scream in pure, unadulterated agony. It was the Marquis' elite guard unit, currently getting completely swarmed by a pack of azure flame wolves amidst a blinding ring of blue fire. The bearded Captain Glenn was screaming his lungs out, desperately trying to keep the squad's formation from getting completely shredded. Glenn cursed through gritted teeth, sweating buckets as he realized the situation was rapidly slipping out of control. He could feel the suffocating threat of death closing in on his subordinates. The wolves were insanely aggressive, relentlessly biting and tearing so fast the soldiers couldn't even react. Blood sprayed all over the forest floor as endless, desperate cries for help filled the air. Glenn blocked a pounce with his shield, his arm violently shaking from the beast's monstrous kinetic force. He couldn't believe a veteran royal guard like him was getting pushed to the brink by a pack of monsters. The other guards were desperately trying to fight back, but were getting completely overwhelmed by the enemy. The blue flames radiating from the wolves pumped out a searing heat, looking ready to incinerate their last shred of hope. Things went from bad to worse when Marvin screamed a warning right behind the captain. Glenn whipped around in a panic, but it was probably way too late to react. 3 azure flame wolves leaped in sync, diving straight for Glenn's blind spot like lethal missiles. Their guttural growls sounded exactly like a death sentence for the exhausted veteran. Glenn's eyes widened in pure terror as the Grim Reaper breathed right down his neck. In that split second, he braced himself for the absolute worst ending imaginable. But at the absolute last microsecond, arrows tore through the wind, scoring perfect headshots on the wolves. The beasts dropped dead instantly before they could even scratch Glenn. A pair of boots slammed onto the dirt with heavy authority, marking the arrival of a totally unexpected third party. Colin and Daku dropped in like literal saviors from the heavens. Colin stood tall, bow in hand, casually asking how it was going like he was just out for a stroll in the park. Colin locked onto the azure flame pack, his brain instantly running the math on their value. To him, their meat, bones, and especially their cores were premium resources worth a literal fortune. One wolf growled and prepped to lunge, but Colin just stood there completely unbothered, zero fear in his eyes. This sight made even the monsters hesitate for a moment. He knocked 3 arrows simultaneously, his eyes radiating a terrifying level of resolve. Colin boldly announced that absolutely 0 wolves were making it out of here in one piece. Instantly, Colin dashed forward, his speed so incredible he left afterimages in the air. He kicked off a tree trunk, using the momentum to launch himself into a spectacular vault. Mid-air, Colin spun and rapid-fired perfectly aimed arrows at the swarming pack. Every single shot packed apocalyptic power, tearing through the dark night like white lasers. Captain Glenn's jaw hit the floor watching a mere servant kid solo dive straight into the most savage monster pack in the forest. He couldn't believe his eyes at Colin's sheer recklessness and god-tier skills. Colin let out a contemptuous smirk, calling the wolves absolute trash who only knew how to hunt in packs. He drew his bowstring tight, prepping for another wave of slaughter with absolute confidence. Arrow after arrow buried into the wolves' heads and chests, dropping them like flies at his feet. Colin weaved flawlessly across the battlefield, completely overwhelming the beasts with terrifying precision. He landed smoothly on one knee, maintaining a tight grip on his bow to counter any sudden situation. Every single movement Colin made screamed of a hardcore veteran hunter. Colin's glare turned colder than absolute zero as he locked onto the surviving wolves. An invisible, suffocating pressure radiated from him, making the very air feel like it was freezing over. The monsters still charged aggressively, despite watching their packmates get absolutely slaughtered right in front of them. Colin frowned slightly, finding their stubbornness incredibly boring and totally pointless. He casually sidestepped as a blur of blue fire rushed past, his face remaining terrifyingly calm. Colin knew damn well the power gap between him and these wild beasts was an unbridgeable chasm. Not just relying on his bow, Colin also delivered a devastating kick straight to the gut of a wolf trying to flank him. The strike was flawless, packing the weight of a boulder. The beast was launched backward, smashing brutally into a rock wall while the elite guards watched in sheer disbelief. Pure shock was painted on their faces as they witnessed the teenager's monstrous physical strength. Colin followed up with a point-blank shot straight to the wolf's chest, securing the kill without a second thought. Blood erupted from the wound, painting the zone red under the eerie glow of the blue flames. He stood up straight, staring indifferently at the monsters dead at his feet. To Colin, they were nothing more than low-tier trash mobs. The pack finally started feeling actual fear at the teenager's psychotic brutality and precision. They growled and backed away, but realized there was absolutely zero escape route from his lethal gaze. Seizing the opening, Colin fired arrows that pierced through the skulls of 3 wolves simultaneously. This godlike accuracy made all the soldiers hold their breath in pure awe. Captain Glenn was completely stunned, cold sweat rolling down his scarred face. He couldn't process how a kid was casually wiping an Azure Flame pack, something his entire elite squad was failing to do. Colin's eyes radiated unwavering authority, hiding the hardcore veteran experience of a warrior who had survived hell in his past life. That was absolutely not the look of a standard servant. A massive pillar of blue light suddenly crashed down right next to Colin, enveloping him in a blinding azure glow. The ground beneath his feet spiderwebbed from the sheer, crushing pressure radiating from the light. Another azure flame wolf spawned right behind Colin, but his senses had already picked up its presence. He snapped his head back, shooting it a highly lethal, cautious glare. The beast roared like a maniac, the blue flames on its body flaring up violently to counter the teenager's terrifying aura. It gathered its strength, prepping for one final pounce. Suddenly, 3 streaks of blue fire ripped through the night, homing straight for Colin. With god-tier reflexes, he smoothly sidestepped, dodging by a hair's breadth. The berserk energy attacks detonated all around him, turning the dark forest into a blazing zone of lethal blue light. He executed a spectacular mid-air backflip, simultaneously raining down 3 arrows that buried themselves straight into a massive wolf's back. Every single movement was absolutely flawless. Colin's face remained locked in maximum focus, every motion perfectly calculated to maximize his damage output. His ice-cold professionalism was evident in every breath he took. Finally, Colin stuck the landing by aggressively stomping his boot right onto the monster's skull, definitively ending the massacre. The entire forest fell back into a terrifying dead silence beneath the fatting glow of the blue flames. Colin strolled over to the freshly killed wolf's corpse. Not wasting a single second, he instantly started harvesting the loot. While Colin was digging for the premium drop inside the Azure's body, asterisk whoosh, an arrow skimmed right past his face. He was totally caught off guard, wondering what the hell just happened. The incredibly powerful arrow buried itself dead center into the blue wolf's skull. Blood sprayed everywhere, accompanied by the beast's agonizing death screech. Colin looked absolutely stunned as he stared at the downed monster. Colin looked over at Daku, who had just sniped the beast right as it was about to ambush him. Daku warned Colin not to drop his guard since this forest was still full of danger. The kid was still playing it super safe even though the main battle was over. Colin just replied with a thumbs up and an incredibly arrogant, confident smirk. It looked like he had the entire situation completely under control, and couldn't care less about any leftover threats. Daku let out a soft sigh, dropping his head in total defeat at Colin's cocky attitude. But deep down, he couldn't deny the absolute raw talent of his peer. Captain Glenn walked over, lowering his shield and scanning Colin with a highly scrutinizing gaze. He admitted both of them had busted skills and was deeply curious about who they served under Marquis Hall. While Daku frantically explained he was just a backup recruit, Colin casually claimed he was nothing but a trash-tier servant. The massive disconnect between the overpowered stats he just flexed and his actual rank made the atmosphere incredibly awkward. The other elite guards, including Marvin and Sierra, bugged their eyes out in pure shock. They couldn't process that the guy who just saved their elite squad was literally a bottom-feeder servant. Glenn was stunned, cold sweat still clinging to his forehead. For a massively proud warrior like him, owing his life to a servant and a rookie was a really bitter pill to swallow. The soldiers started aggressively gossiping in the background, calling Colin the old hag's lapdog. It seemed the toxic political split in the Hall family had completely infected even these troops. Daku looked completely lost at the phrase, old hag. They just dropped. The kid was still way too naive to grasp the filthy political schemes happening inside the estate. Colin completely ignored the trash talk. In his hand was a monster crystal radiating a mystical purple glow. He confirmed this was a mid-tier monster core, an insanely high-value material. He rolled the core around in his hand, secretly calculating alchemy recipes based on the ancient grimoire's instructions. This was a massive stepping stone for Colin to power up in the future. Suddenly, a loud bark echoed out. "Hey, you little brat!" Colin narrowed his eyes, shooting an ice-cold glare right at the guy who just ran his mouth. Marvin stomped over looking ready to commit murder, loudly demanding to know who gave a filthy servant permission to touch the monster's corpse. Pure jealousy was visibly pulsing through every muscle in the soldier's face. Glenn intervened just in time, ordering Marvin to let Colin keep the core since their top priority right now was clearing the Marquis' mission. Despite being annoyed, the captain kept his cool. Colin looked them dead in the eye, internally mocking their audacity for calling their literal savior a brat. He maintained a deadpan expression, but the heavy pressure radiating from his stare made them physically shudder. Marvin grew even more furious seeing Colin's zero-fear attitude, thick veins popping on his forehead. The soldier simply couldn't handle being looked down upon by someone with a lower social rank. He roared, lunging forward to teach Colin a lesson, but Glenn and Sierra instantly grabbed him. Marvin's toxic cursing disturbed the entire forest, while Colin just stood there, totally unfazed like a statue. Colin's eyes remained as cold and deep as an abyss, seeing right through the raging idiot in front of him. He just gave a slight, faint smile, a smile packed with quiet, absolute disgust. An image of the imposing Marquis Darius flashed in his mind, triggering memories of a highly chaotic past. Colin knew exactly how crucial these specific soldiers were to the Hall family's future. He remembered a commemorative photo of the three most loyal royal guards standing next to Cornell. They used to be the Marquis' sharpest blades, defending the family's glory across countless battles. Colin looked at Glenn, Marvin, and Sierra with a highly complex expression, knowing these were the three people Marquis Darius trusted the most. Their presence here definitely wasn't just a random encounter. A tragic memory from his past life surfaced, where this exact trio got wiped in this very forest. Their sacrifice had severely weakened the Marquis' political power, kicking off a chain of pure tragedy. Snapping back to reality, Daku was frantically apologizing, making excuses that Colin was a total rookie who didn't understand military rules yet. The kid was desperately trying to diffuse the hypertense atmosphere. Sierra let out a cold, extremely arrogant scoff. She told the old hag's dog he better shut his mouth right now if he wanted to avoid trouble. Daku just stood there stunned, repeating the word dog, looking like he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He never expected him and Colin to get treated like literal garbage right after risking their lives to save them. Glenn's boots stomped heavily on the dirt as he marched up to Colin. The crushing authority of a veteran captain once again flooded the zone. Glenn stood face to face with Colin, lowering his voice to admit that the kid was seriously strong. That was an incredibly rare drop of praise coming from a proud veteran like the bearded captain. However, he instantly followed it up with an ice-cold threat. If you don't immediately drop these ambitions that are way above your station, you're going to deeply regret it." Glenn's eyes practically screamed a massive warning. Colin stayed completely silent, his gaze never wavering as he stared Glenn down. He didn't need to say a single word. His unbreakable posture was the loudest answer possible. Glenn gave a slight nod, dropping a half-hearted thanks, before signaling his squad to move out and resume the mission. The shadows of the elite guards slowly vanished into the trees, leaving Colin and Daku alone with the monster corpses. A heavy, ominous footstep echoed against the dirt in the deep, dark forest. Glenn, Sierra, and Marvin's guard unit was completely panicking. They felt a horrifying wave of killing intent rapidly closing in on their position. The forest birds went totally crazy, scattering into the sky like an early warning system for an incoming disaster. The massive tremors from the distance were getting louder by the second. From the thick brush, an absolute tidal wave of wolves with coats blazing in blue fire poured out. These were the hyper-aggressive Azure Flame wolves. Sierra and Marvin's faces completely drained of color seeing the absolutely massive enemy numbers. In pure despair, they could only let out terrified gasps. A deafening, earth-shattering roar shook the entire zone, completely drowning out the howling of the smaller wolves. Sierra shrieked as she recognized the alpha monster. It was the Azure King, the absolute boss of the wolf pack, boasting a massive size and completely overpowered strength. The alpha boss loomed into view, wreathed in blinding blue fire and flanked by a horde of bloodthirsty minions. Its raw pressure was enough to make even the most hardcore veterans physically shake. A close-up on the monster's maw full of razor-sharp fangs and its glowing, blood-red eyes. It was staring at the human party like they were a delicious meal. The Azure King swung its razor-sharp claws, aggressively forcing the guard unit into a complete dead end. Every single escape route was totally blocked by the fire wolves. Absolute panic was plastered across every single guard's face. They realized they had zero chance of winning against this kind of overwhelming power. Glenn ground his teeth, desperately trying to keep his cool in this hopeless situation. As the captain, he knew full well this was probably their final stand. The Azure King launched its ultimate attack, a massive blue mana explosion that swept across the battlefield. Its kinetic force completely blew away everything in its path. In that literal life-or-death microsecond, a silhouette suddenly dashed in. A painful groan echoed as someone actually dared to face-tank the monster. Glenn stared in absolute shock at the back of the person who just appeared. He couldn't believe someone was crazy enough to step up and save him right now. Colin Hall materialized, sword in hand, solo blocking the Azure King's lethal claw strike. He casually dropped a "my bad," acting like he was just a little late coming back from a stroll. Colin flashed an insanely arrogant grin, declaring he had literally just saved their lives all over again. His eyes radiated the absolute confidence of someone controlling the entire game. Completely humiliated by a puny human, the Azure King roared like a maniac. It bared its fangs and flexed its claws, winding up for a bloody, full-combo execution. Colin didn't keep the opponent waiting. He instantly booted up his masterclass sword techniques. Sword art! The second the words dropped, a terrifying power exploded from his blade. A devastating heavy attack named Mountain Breaker slammed straight down onto the monster's skull. The kinetic force was so immense it spawned actual mana lightning tearing through the air. The alpha boss tanked the hit and was still standing. Its body seemed literally hard as steel, not even taking a single noticeable scratch. Colin dashed back a step, physically feeling how insanely tanky the target was. He started mentally recalculating the opponent's true power. The Azure King countered with a massive blue fire breath. The violent flames completely blanketed Colin's position, instantly turning everything in the area to ash. Colin dual-wielded to block the massive fire breath, but the apocalyptic pressure kept knocking him backward. The monster's power was way higher than his initial estimates. He vaulted high into the air to completely clear the explosion's radius. Down below, the ground literally shattered from the sheer force of the blue fire magic. Colin's eyes narrowed, running hardcore tactical calculations. He realized that with his current body, clearing the Azure King with purely physical sword skills was going to be incredibly difficult. The sword in his hand was already starting to shatter from the direct clashes. This garbage-tier weapon simply couldn't handle the extreme intensity of a top-tier battle. Glenn and the guard unit pushed up to provide backline support. The veteran captain nervously checked on the teenager who had just intervened to help. However, Sira dropped a massive warning that this opponent had already slaughtered countless Imperial elites. The beast narrowed its eyes at the humans, signaling its minions to prep for a massive, full-scale assault. It was completely out of patience and done playing with its food. The fire wolves formed a massive, unbroken horizontal frontline, completely boxing in Colin's group. Their sheer numbers were enough to crush any small army. Marvin was sweating buckets in pure panic. He had absolutely no idea what to do since they were already struggling against the pups, and now they had an enraged wolf king to deal with. Colin calmly turned back, telling everyone to completely ignore the minions. He explained that the smaller wolves were literally just puppets controlled by the Azure King. He pointed out their critical weakness. The minions only followed orders and had zero independent will. If they just took down the king, the rest of the pack would automatically scatter. Glenn stared at the kid, his face painted with massive skepticism. The idea of full-frontal attacking the Wolf King sounded absolutely crazy in this situation. Daku tried to talk him out of it, arguing that even the elites couldn't take it down. On top of that, Colin's weapon was practically destroyed. Colin flashed a razor-sharp smirk, his blue eyes flaring with absolute resolve. He fired back with a highly cocky challenge. "How do you know if you don't even try?" Daku looked at Colin like he was a total psycho. In his eyes, attempting this was literally just suicide. Glenn and the rest of the party were still heavily hesitating. Sprinting through a massive horde of wolves just to get into melee range of the primary target was a nearly impossible mission. Colin stepped up to the front line, telling them they didn't need to do anything. He already had his own personal plan cooked up to deal with the monster wave. The teenager's glare turned colder and sharper than ever. He confidently stated that a perfect window to finish this would open up very soon. The Azure King tilted its head to the sky, winding up for a massive howl to trigger the final attack. The very air around it started turning thick from the insane magic pressure. The deafening howl echoed across the forest, triggering the minions to rush and tear the enemy apart. The real life-or-death battle was officially kicking off. The guard squad physically felt the crushing pressure from the monster wave. Sira and Marvin hit max stress levels as the fire wolves flooded forward like a tidal wave. Glenn roared, ordering the squad to hold their nerve and prep for combat. Swords were drawn, but you could clearly see the anxiety on everyone's faces. Colin narrowed his eyes at the charging pack, dropping his voice into a heavy, highly authoritative tone. "Lure them in closer." Marvin absolutely lost it, screaming about why the hell some busboy had the right to order them around. Glenn had to instantly shut him down, barking that now was not the time for internal bickering. Marvin kept shooting incredibly salty glares at Captain Glenn. He was seriously furious about taking orders from a literal bottom feeder like Colin. Completely ignoring Marvin's bad attitude, Colin turned and called Daku to follow him. Daku dumbly pointed at his own face, totally clueless about how he could possibly help right now. Colin looked Daku dead in the eye, dropping an absolute psychological nuke. "You want to be a big brother your little sister can actually be proud of, right?" The second Erika's name dropped, Daku's gaze hardened like steel. His initial panic completely vanished. He knew he had to get stronger if he actually wanted to protect his little sister. Glenn roared a red alert as the fire wolves entered melee range. The guard formation instantly tightened up to tank the first wave of the berserk attack. Colin just stood there like a statue, screaming, "Not yet," physically stopping the guards from acting too hastily. The fire wolves lunged with blazing fangs and claws. Colin coldly kept repeating his command, "Lure them even deeper." A massive wolf vaulted high into the air, its roar shrieking through the wind as it locked its trajectory dead onto the guard unit. Now, Colin's scream shattered the air, acting as the starting pistol for the Royal Guard's all-out counterattack. Colin specifically called out Glenn, ordering him to use his ultimate, Holy Light Aegis, to blind the monsters. It was an absolutely flawless tactical decision. Glenn executed the Holy Light Aegis sword art, his shield erupting with a blinding magical flash. The kinetic blast launched the incoming wolves into the air like ragdolls. Refusing to give the enemies a single second to breathe, Colin immediately ordered Marvin to blow them away with his Heaven Shaker skill. Their terrifyingly smooth coordination was finally taking shape. Marvin swung his colossal broadsword, dumping his entire strength into the Heaven Shaker ultimate. The massive slash generated an apocalyptic air pressure that ripped the ground apart. The hit triggered a massive mana explosion, blasting the fire wolves miles away and completely wrecking everything around Marvin's position. Colin seamlessly ordered Sierra to carve a path using Phantom Blade. Not wasting a single second, she drew her sword and dove straight into the center of the monster pack. Sierra dashed like a literal ghost, her Phantom Blade slashes tearing the fire wolves to shreds. Monster blood sprayed everywhere as she cleaved a bloody path right through the enemy encirclement. All three guards, Glenn, Sierra, and Marvin, were completely mind-blown. They couldn't fathom how a random servant knew the exact secret techniques of their specific weapons. Glenn was sweating buckets. His view of Colin had completely shifted to sheer, unadulterated awe. The kid's knowledge was truly beyond any logical explanation. Colin signaled Daku to push. "Let's go, Daku!" The duo sprinted full speed ahead, leaving the guard unit behind to finish dealing with the remnants. Sierra cleaved a wolf down while screaming toxically, "Don't you dare drag us down, you little puppy!" Even though she was saved, she still hadn't fully acknowledged Colin's true strength. Daku was sprinting while totally panicking, wondering what the hell Colin had been rambling about this whole time. He still hadn't managed to catch up with his partner's train of thought. The two dashed through the battlefield littered with wolf corpses and raging blue fire. Colin took the lead with terrifying calmness, masterfully dodging every single attack. Daku screamed, demanding to know what Colin's actual master plan was. He feared for both their lives, seeing them head straight into danger without a clear strategy. Colin shot Daku a side-eye, casually nodding that whether it's humans or monsters, the core nature of fear is exactly the same. He explained that the Azure King was way too used to seeing enemies tremble before it. If an opponent just charged in without hesitating, that alone would be enough to shake its mental state. Daku nervously pointed out that Colin didn't even have a functioning sword left to fight with. Colin just calmly replied that swordsmanship wasn't his only method of attack. "No way, magic!" The absolute insanity of that thought made Daku freeze so hard he almost tripped right in the middle of the battle. Colin started channeling, razor-sharp shards of blue ice materializing and orbiting his hands. An absolutely freezing mana aura began expanding, completely locking down the surrounding space. Unsealing mana circuits, activating internal magic flow. Colin muttered the incantation as the grimoire levitated, radiating an insanely bright light. The magic array appeared, and Colin unleashed his Ice Lotus ultimate. An apocalyptic beam of freezing energy fired straight at the Wolf King, literally freezing everything in its path. Daku stood totally paralyzed by that horrifying sight. He could not believe how a servant like Colin could wield such high-tier magic. The Azure King roared in pure agony as it took the freezing magic blast head-on. The blue flames on its body desperately flared up to counter it, but were completely useless. Colin gave the monster a highly disrespectful side-eye, his voice dripping with pure taunt. "You still want to keep fighting?" His suffocating killing intent actually forced the beast to hesitate. Both Colin and Daku aggressively closed in on the enemy. The duo coordinated so perfectly it looked like they had rehearsed it, leaving the Azure King with no time to react. Daku rushed in like an arrow, using his entire physical strength to lock down any resistance from the colossal wolf. "Perfect, Daku," Colin praised him as he watched Daku land a critical stab right into the beast's head. The monster roared in agony, sensing the end of the battle had arrived. Colin supercharged his remaining mana, his eyes locked onto the Azure King with lethal intent. "It's over, you dead scum." A towering, majestic ice elemental spawned straight out of Colin's magic array. It swung a colossal greatsword of ice, delivering the absolute final critical strike to completely execute the Wolf King. The Alpha Azure King's eyes bulged, a final flicker of bright red light flashing in its pupils, filled with absolute terror. Boom, an insanely overpowered blast of magic pierced straight through the monster. It never expected it would suffer such terrifying magical power from a human. The berserk magic laser blew a hole clean through the monster's body in a flash. A desperate death shriek echoed as blood exploded everywhere. The Azure King was tanking the ultimate critical hit. The shockwave from the explosion swept across the forest, instantly wiping all the surrounding pups as the Alpha Azure King was finally completely overwhelmed. The colossal monster was finally downed, its body completely frozen solid and lying motionless under the absolute raw power of Colin's strike. Daku stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with sheer horror at the insanely terrifying power he just witnessed with his own eyes from his friend. Colin kept his calm demeanor, shards of magical ice still casually floating around his hands as the grimoire began to close. Glenn, Marvin, and Sierra frantically rushed to the scene, their faces showing a mix of massive relief and absolute shock after being saved. Glenn openly admitted that thanks to Colin killing the Alpha, the Berserk Fire Wolf Pack had finally scattered. Sierra walked over and stepped on a shattered piece of blue ice on the ground, looking like she was trying to confirm something. Sierra knelt down to inspect the remaining ice debris, still utterly refusing to believe a servant could possess such terrifying magic. Marvin let out a loud, hearty laugh, commenting that Colin's fighting style totally reminded him of the Grand Captain back in his youth. Marvin shot Daku a razor-sharp look, reminding them that they used to be hardcore warriors from the legendary Lionheart Legion. Sierra stood there looking arrogant, dropping a highly toxic, condescending remark that made Daku's face burn and his eyebrows twitch in pure rage. Daku felt his pride take a massive hit from the female guard's incredibly arrogant, trash-talking attitude. He finally lost his patience, pointing his finger straight at Sierra's face and snapping, demanding to know what she just called him with that tone. Daku screamed his own name, ordering Sierra to memorize it right now so she'd never be allowed to get it wrong again. Sierra froze from Daku's sudden outburst, completely stunned for a second because she never expected someone like him to actually shout at her. Marvin leaned in and whispered to Daku that Sierra had a habit of calling the lady an old hag, which was the root cause of the current tension. Daku's jaw hit the floor, completely shocked by Sierra's sheer audacity and total lack of respect for their superiors. Sierra instantly got aggressive, getting right in Daku's face and growling, demanding to know exactly where on her face looked old. Daku didn't hold back, firing back that she was clearly way past her prime, and watching her try to act young was painful to the eyes. Glenn and Marvin just stood there helplessly watching them argue. Marvin even had to physically hold Daku back to prevent a brawl. Colin stood far back, observing the argument with cold, indifferent eyes. It seemed he couldn't care less about this trivial drama. An image flashed, bringing to mind the synergy between the members, a super rare moment of absolute coordination in combat. Suddenly, the rapid, heavy thudding of horse hooves echoed through the forest dirt, completely shattering the noisy atmosphere and stealing all the attention. Freed Hall rode up on horseback, glaring down at the group with the arrogant, elitist sneer of an air. The guard unit was completely caught off guard by Freed Hall's sudden appearance. Sierra looked up at the young master, her face clearly showing massive confusion. Colin shot a side-eye at Freed, his gaze narrowing with high-alert caution mixed with a bit of disgust for the newcomer. Daku's face showed heavy anxiety, cold sweat rolling down his cheeks but deep in his eyes. A massive red flag popped up when Freed Hall arrived and saw the wrecked environment. The entire guard squad, including Glenn and Marvin, instantly took a knee to bow respectfully in front of Freed Hall. Freed sat high on his mount, his razor-sharp, highly calculating eyes scanning every single person kneeling at his feet. He coldly interrogated them about the Azure Flames monsters and demanded an explanation of what actually went down in this deep forest. Glenn started reporting the situation, explaining they were just executing an investigation mission when they got fiercely ambushed by the monster wave. Freed's gaze locked straight onto Colin Hall, who was currently crouched next to a wolf corpse, casually hoarding all the loot. Colin slightly turned his head to look at Freed Hall, a highly cryptic, wildly arrogant smirk flashing on his lips, practically begging the opponent to try something. Glenn continued his report, making sure to drop massive praise for the raw potential and outstanding combat achievements of the two teenagers. Freed Hall had a flashback of Colin Hall standing there, sword drawn, looking like an absolute boss, showing exactly zero fear of Freed Hall's presence. Freed started theory-crafting the succession war. He realized Colin's rise was a serious, massive threat to his position. He ground his teeth in pure rage, furious over the fact that his father might learn about this and dump all his favor onto the adopted son, Colin. Freed Hall's eyes practically glowed with boiling hatred and toxic jealousy, now that he was face to face with a massive new potential competitor. Daku stared straight ahead, sweating bullets watching Colin flex so arrogantly on Freed. He was sure Colin was about to get punished by the superior. A highly calculated, wildly confident smirk crept onto Freed Hall's face. It looked like he had already drafted a flawless strategy to eliminate Colin Hall. Freed Hall sat on his mount, looking down at Daku with absolute disgust as he kneeled. The servant boy just kept his head down, terrified to even face the arrogant noble. He sarcastically mocked Daku for daring to enter the restricted hunting zone, wondering why he was hanging out with trash like Colin Hall. Daku was physically shaking, sweat pouring down his panicked face. Daku just tanked the toxic humiliation in silence, not daring to drop a single line of defense. His face was a mask of pure terror against the crushing authority of his superior. Freed Hall kept twisting the knife, name-dropping Daku's little sister, Erika, to threaten his loyalty. He knew exactly what Daku's critical weakness was and had zero hesitation exploiting it for leverage. Colin Hall stood in the back and dropped a massive insult, calling Cornell a pampered little mama's boy who only coasted on nepotism. His razor-sharp words left everyone present completely shell-shocked. He casually turned around, looking the noble dead in the eye with a hyper-arrogant, taunting smirk. Colin showed absolute zero fear of the opponent's status or power. Sierra actually broke character and burst out laughing at Colin's insane audacity, while Glenn stood in the back looking dead serious. Her laugh rubbed pure salt into Freed's pride. Taking massive critical damage to his pride, Freed Hall went completely nuclear, screaming at Colin to repeat what he just said. The noble's face twisted into an ugly mask of uncontrollable rage. Colin kept his poker face, brutally stating that these people weren't kneeling out of respect for Freed's actual talents. His ice-cold gaze drilled right into the truth the noble constantly tried to ignore. Glenn, Sierra, and the other guards were visibly sweating as the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. They realized Colin was playing an incredibly dangerous game. The guards escorting Freed Hall were totally stunned, unable to believe their ears hearing a literal slave dropping such lethal insults. The atmosphere instantly thickened with suffocating killing intent. Colin followed up with another jab, saying it must be awesome getting to boss people around purely because of the shadow of your powerful parents. He smirked, totally soaking in his opponent's absolute humiliation. Freed Hall screamed that he could kill Colin with zero effort, but Colin just gave him a totally indifferent reaction. The massive gap in their social ranks didn't make Colin flinch. He gave a highly sarcastic wink, suggesting that if Cornell really wanted to commit murder, he better go ask his mommy for permission first. The brutal trash talk aimed right at his pathetic dependence on his family. Colin even put on a baby voice to mock Freed, turning the elite noble into an absolute clown in front of his own subordinates. Every single word he dropped acted like a dagger straight to Freed's pride. Freed ground his teeth hard enough to break them, the sheer humiliation completely stripping away his usual calm persona. His bloodshot eyes were overflowing with pure, toxic hatred. He roared, ordering his minions to instantly capture and restrain Colin. Colin just stood with his back turned, calmly waiting for the incoming attack. A burst of dark mana exploded under Colin's feet, summoning magical chains straight out of the void. He didn't even twitch, totally ignoring the enemy encirclement. A magical chain whipped forward at breakneck speed, homing right in on Colin. He calmly tracked its trajectory, his eyes not wavering for a single moment. Colin just slightly shifted his gaze to watch the chain wrap around him, totally prepped for the absolute worst-case scenario. It looked like he had already predicted Freed Hall's move. The freezing chain tightly coiled around Colin's arm, completely stripping his mobility. The magical loops radiated a faint blue light, tightly locking down his small body. In a split second, Colin was fully chained up and surrounded by terrifying, demon-masked assassins. These guys spawned in silently, like literal ghosts out of the deep woods. One assassin pressed a gleaming blade right against Colin's throat, ready to execute him with a single twitch. Colin still maintained his bizarrely deadpan expression. Glenn gasped in horror as he recognized this kill squad, They were the legendary Blades of the Empire. Sierra and Marvin's faces were also painted with absolute terror. Sierra explained this was an elite squad of assassins and spies that exclusively served the Williams family. Their reputation for pure brutality and god-tier skills made even high-ranking nobles sweat. The mastermind behind these blades was none other than Katrina Williams, the powerful woman who always overprotected her son. An image of her flashed, dripping with absolute authority and scheming. Glenn couldn't believe the lady actually deployed a top-tier army like this just to protect Freed Hall on a minor investigation mission. He stared at the magic chains with extreme caution. Glenn stepped up to try and block Freed, desperately trying to intervene to prevent a totally pointless bloodbath. He was terrified the spoiled brat's impulsive act would lead to unpredictable consequences. Freed Hall glared a hole straight through Glenn, his eyes radiating pure killing intent, silently asking if the old man dared to defy his orders. The crushing authority of the Williams family weighed heavily on the veteran captain's shoulders. Glenn hesitated, cold sweat pouring down his face as he faced massive political pressure. He knew he was standing at an incredibly difficult crossroads between justice and loyalty. Colin looked over at Glenn with a completely chill expression, like he had already understood everything. It seemed he didn't want the old man getting dragged into this mess. He told Glenn to just ignore him and go report the investigation results to the guild master. Colin's voice was dead calm, even with a razor-sharp blade pressed right against his neck. Glenn realized Colin was intentionally holding all the attention just to give his squad a safe escape route. That kind of silent sacrifice made the old man's heart ache. Sierra also realized they couldn't take a side in this dispute and advised Glenn to back off. She knew their presence would only add more complications to the situation. Glenn ground his teeth in pure frustration, but he had to swallow his rage for the sake of the bigger picture. His face was a mask of absolute helplessness against the corrupted power. The elite guards bowed and formally requested to withdraw in silence. Freed Hall watched them go with a smug grin, totally satisfied that he had eliminated the obstacles. He turned to Colin with the absolute arrogance of a winner, asking if the kid finally realized how completely powerless he was. Freed Hall wanted to break his opponent's unbreakable will. Colin just fired back with a wildly arrogant smirk, telling the bastard to just get on with it already. His stubbornness made Freed tilt even harder. The noble sneered. It looked like he had just come up with an even more psychotic new game. A highly dangerous glint flashed in his eyes. Freed Hall unsheathed his sword, the cold ring of steel echoing sharply in the air. He announced he had just thought of an absolutely brilliant way to punish Colin. Daku violently flinched when he heard his own name called, his instincts screaming that something terrible was about to happen. The kid was shaking, his eyes overflowing with pure despair. Freed Hall glared a hole straight through Daku, reminding him that every single action comes with an equal responsibility. The glare off his blade perfectly highlighted the psychotic smile on his face. Freed Hall hurled his sword, burying the blade deep into the dirt right in front of Daku with a heavy, authoritative thud. He declared he was giving him one final chance to redeem his mistakes. The noble looked incredibly smug as he dropped the ultimate brutal demand. Daku had to personally execute Colin Hall. His eyes flashed with malice, waiting for his subordinate's reaction. Daku was totally paralyzed by the deranged command, cold sweat pouring down his ghost-white face. He literally couldn't believe his ears. He was forced into a corner where he had to kill his savior. Freed swore that if Daku carried out this request, he would let everything that happened slide. In the background, Colin was still locked in heavy chains with a blade to his throat, completely stuck in a passive state. Suddenly, a massive flashback from his past life flooded Colin's brain, dragging him right back to 1 month after the demon invasion began. A highly depressing atmosphere blanketed a concentration camp, absolutely swarming with enemies. Massive, hyper-aggressive demons were guarding the entire area, completely surrounding the human prisoners who were huddled together in misery. This tragic scene was an unforgettable nightmare for Colin. In the flashback, a demon delivered a brutal, god-tier stomp to Colin's back, making him face-plant into the dirt. The enemy's raw power was way too overwhelming for human endurance back then. He collapsed on the grass, groaning in agony while the colossal demons loomed behind him, mocking how incredibly weak humans were. Colin back then was completely unarmed, totally helpless against his fate. A massive broadsword slammed into the dirt right in front of Colin's eyes, like an ultimate challenge from the Supreme Demon. He looked up, his eyes filled with pure hatred but also absolute despair. High up on his throne, the Demon Lord sat with maximum arrogance, openly mocking the so-called savior, currently pathetic at his feet. He radiated an apocalyptic pressure that made the entire space feel suffocating. The Demon Lord proposed a highly malicious deal. He would release the human hostages if Colin accepted one brutal condition. The pathetic prisoners stared at Colin with desperate, pleading eyes. That condition was that Colin had to personally kill his own captured party member. A massive demon had his friend in a hard lock, creating an exact replica of the current situation. The party member was covered in wounds, his face completely mangled from torture, screaming in agony and begging Colin to just do it. He was 100% ready to sacrifice his own life to buy everyone else's freedom. The Demon Lord flashed a blood-curdling grin, his eyes glowing with hype to watch this cruel theater play out. He was absolutely loving watching a human mentally tortured between comradeship and the greater good. Colin stood completely frozen, white-knuckling the sword hilt, his head bowed to hide the massive internal conflict. The demon's laugh echoed through the zone, rubbing pure salt into his open wounds. The gleaming sword in Colin's hand vibrated violently with every beat of his heart. Right in front of him, his friend was still controlled by the demon, waiting for Colin to deliver the final killing blow. Colin took heavy, dragging steps, his boots crushing the dry grass and creating highly ominous rustling sounds. The tension was at absolute max. Nobody dared to even breathe. The party member in the flashback, his face a mess of injuries, choked up as he mentioned that the exact day they got the news of their dad's death was also his little sister Erica's birthday. A crystal-clear image flashed of the two siblings hugging and sobbing their eyes out in absolute poverty. The older brother in the past had tried his absolute hardest to protect and shelter his little sister from life's disasters. After their mom also died from a severe illness, both became slaves but luckily got adopted by Lord Darius. Colin squeezed his eyes shut. The pain from that past life still felt perfectly intact in his soul. On the lady's orders, Erica was transferred to the Williams family estate. The older brother believed she was still safe because the demon army hadn't pushed that deep into the territory yet. A single tear rolled down his scarred face as the older brother desperately begged Colin to take over caring for Erica after he was gone. Those tragic final words made Colin's heart ache intensely. Colin listened to the final instructions about Erica's eating habits, a tiny detail, but packed with an infinite amount of love. His face was completely shadowed, masking the absolute emotional meltdown happening inside. He just wanted Erica to know her big brother had sacrificed himself like a true knight, rather than a cowardly slave. It was a beautiful lie so she could still be proud of her only relative. The flashback sequence ended with a choked-up apology dedicated to Daku. The past scene faded out, giving way to a present reality packed with the exact same toxic traps. Back in the present, Daku stood face-to-face with Colin, his sword hand shaking violently while the masked assassins watched. This entire situation was a one copy of the Demon Lord's psychotic game from back then. Colin stood tall amidst the chains, his razor-sharp gaze locked onto Daku, waiting for him to make a call. He showed absolutely zero fear, not begging for mercy for a single second. Daku gripped the hilt until his knuckles turned white, sweating oceans under the crushing psychological pressure. He was standing right at the crossroads of betrayal and brotherhood. Freed Hall barked from his horse, asking what the hell Daku was hesitating for and ordering him to do it now. The noble relished the power trip of holding someone else's fate in the palm of his hand. Daku's hesitation made Freed even more annoyed. He glared and yelled, demanding the servant prove his absolute loyalty. Daku just stood there frozen, the sword feeling heavier than a boulder in his hand. Daku screamed in pure despair, stating that if it weren't for Colin, they all would have died a long time ago. He just couldn't bring himself to execute the guy who literally pulled him out of the wolf's jaws. Freed Hall raised an eyebrow, heavily mocking Daku's gratitude toward a filthy slave. He scoffed, brushing it off as the pathetic, sentimental whining of the weak. The noble smirked, twisting the knife by asking what Erika would think if she knew her big brother abandoned her just to save some random stranger. The psychological attack hit Daku right in his biggest weak spot. Daku was stunned, all the color draining from his face at Freed Hall's threat. He kept denying it, trying to fight off the manipulation, but his mental armor was rapidly cracking. Freed Hall casually announced that he had just received an update about Erika from the Williams family's head butler. Sitting on his horse, he leisurely dropped razor-sharp words to completely mentally break his subordinate. He revealed that Erika had been starving herself, skipping meals just to save up money to buy her brother a nice sword, passing out from pure exhaustion last week. Freed looked incredibly smug seeing Daku's spirit completely shatter. The news about his little sister hit Daku like a truck, his eyes rolling back in pure shock and agony. The brutal reality made all his logic about honor and brotherhood feel entirely worthless. Freed Hall cracked his riding crop, coldly declaring that if Daku still planned to commit treason, he'd have absolutely zero reason to keep taking care of Erika. He turned his horse to leave, ditching Daku in a pit of impossible choices. Daku screamed and chased after him, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. His cry echoed through the forest, carrying the sheer desperation and helplessness of a man crushed by absolute authority. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at the grass, desperately begging Freed Hall to save his little sister. Every ounce of his pride as a knight in training was brutally trampled under the boot of the elite. The noble turned his horse back around, looking down at Daku's shattered will with a sick sense of satisfaction. He knew he had completely hijacked this puppet for his next twisted act. The noble flashed a wicked smile, ordering Daku to execute Colin Hall right this second to buy Erika's life. The ice-cold command dropped like a literal death sentence on their friendship. Colin Hall smirked, closing his eyes like he was enjoying some highly ironic joke. He muttered quietly to himself, wondering if these clowns seriously thought they could actually kill him. Colin burst into loud, arrogant laughter, standing perfectly straight despite the heavy chains locking him down. The two blades of the Empire assassins had to physically strain just to keep him pinned in place. Freed Hall glared down from his horse, clearly rattled by the prisoner's totally unexpected reaction. He demanded to know what the hell Colin found so funny about being on death row. Colin's eyes snapped open, his azure gaze razor-sharp and overflowing with killing intent. He flashed a challenging grin, stating that even a stray dog knows how to bark, but a coward lower than a dog could never kill him. Daku stood completely paralyzed, his eyes wide with shock hearing Colin drop such insanely provocative trash talk. Despite the chains, Colin spun around to face the noble on horseback. He proposed a death match between him and Daku, betting that would be way more entertaining than watching Freed's subordinate whine. Freed Hall narrowed his eyes suspiciously, trying to calculate what the hell Colin was scheming. He still didn't fully buy the prisoner's sudden urge to fight to the death. Colin maintained his piercing glare, even with the blades of the Empire assassin pressing a dagger to his back. The tension hit max capacity as everyone waited on Freed's call. Freed Hall's confusion quickly morphed into a totally condescending sneer. He assumed Colin was just trying to act tough to mask his fear of the elite assassins. Deciding the proposal sounded fun enough, Freed Hall raised his hand and greenlit the duel. Instantly, the blades of the Empire assassins released their grip on the chains. The heavy metal chains slid off Colin Hall's shoulders, crashing heavily onto the dry dirt. The clanking metal echoed sharply through the dead silence of the forest. Colin Hall and Daku faced off in the clearing, both already locked into combat stances with swords drawn. The assassins backed off, forming a loose perimeter around the two fighters. Daku gripped his hilt tight with both hands, his whole body tensed and prepped for the clash. A sharp visual effect emphasized the sudden, intense shift in the battle's atmosphere. Sweat rolled down Daku's forehead as he stared down his opponent's completely calm face. He quietly asked if Colin was seriously going through with this deathmatch. Freed Hall leaned forward in the saddle, his voice dripping with malice as he reminded Daku about his precious little sister. He wanted to make sure the young man's desperation forced him to fight as brutally as possible. Completely ignoring the noble's taunts, Colin dashed forward with blinding speed. He roared, commanding Daku not to let his little sister down, weaponizing the emotional pressure to force an opening. Instead of a sword strike, Colin launched a devastating high kick aimed straight at Daku's guard. Daku braced himself to tank the kick, his armor rattling violently as he was knocked back several paces. He struggled to keep his balance against Colin's relentless opening assault. Colin didn't give his opponent a single frame to recover, spinning midair to chain his next attack. Daku barely managed to throw his arms up to block Colin's relentless combo. He realized with absolute horror that his friend's speed was leagues beyond anything he ever imagined. Colin swung his sword down in a brutal vertical arc, perfectly utilizing his downward momentum for maximum DPS. Metal shrieked against metal as the two blades collided, sending a shower of bright sparks exploding between them. Colin's face remained eerily calm as he forced his blade down with crushing pressure. Daku ground his teeth, fighting back, his mind in total chaos from the brutal reality of the situation. Colin narrowed his eyes, staring dead into Daku's pupils, his azure gaze completely unwavering. He muttered a quiet apology, firmly stating that he had absolutely zero intention of dying here either. Daku's pupils shrank, a faint red glow igniting in his eyes as his adrenaline spiked to critical levels. With a roar from the bottom of his lungs, Daku burned all his strength to parry Colin's blade, swinging a massive counterslash. Colin reacted instantly, backstepping to dodge Daku's razor-sharp blade that skimmed past him by a hair's breadth. Landing cleanly, Colin held up 3 fingers right in front of his opponent. He loudly declared he was going to end this entire match in exactly 3 moves. A highly confident smirk spread across Colin's face as he pointed straight at Daku. He dared his friend to see if he could even survive the next incoming combo. Daku panted heavily, his eyes still burning with that blood-red killing intent. He glared at Colin, fully acknowledging the apocalyptic pressure radiating from his opponent. Rejecting Colin's claim, Daku pointed right back with fierce resolve. He swore he didn't even need 3 moves. He was going to end everything in exactly 3 seconds. Daku's gaze turned razor-sharp, his absolute focus locked onto Colin's every microscopic movement. Colin just casually smirked, looking like he wholeheartedly welcomed his opponent's sudden burst of confidence and resolve. The 2 warriors stood at opposite ends of the path, the space between them flooded with killing intent and max-level tension. Watching from afar, Freed Hall let out an excited gasp. Colin's boots dug deep into the dirt as he wound up to launch himself forward like a missile. At the exact same time, Daku stomped the ground, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. They collided midair, their models blurring from the hyperspeed movements and the chaotic flurry of sword strikes. Colin's lips moved slightly during the clash, repeating his oath to never, ever abandon a comrade. The 2 swords deadlocked once again, their faces just inches apart. Colin's eyes were 100% focused, while Daku was burning everything he had just to keep from getting stat-checked. An image of a mysterious character in a white cloak flashed briefly in Colin's memories. Those promises about protecting his comrades echoed loudly in his soul once more. Daku's head dipped slightly, his face shadowed as he felt the momentum of the battle starting to shift against him. A single drop of sweat dripped from his chin. Their footwork was insanely fast across the forest floor, every single step perfectly calculated with clear tactical intent. The 2 blades of the Empire assassins froze simultaneously, their red eyes glowing under their skull masks, absolutely stunned by the fight's insane packing. Amidst the thick dust cloud, Colin and Daku moved at supersonic speeds, generating violent wind vortexes all around their hitboxes. An earth-shattering explosion triggered, creating a massive pressure column that blew away the dirt, rocks, and dead branches surrounding the arena. The 2 nearby spectators were violently pushed back by the massive air pressure, forced to throw their arms up just to stay balanced against the hurricane. Freed Hall frantically yanked his reins to keep his horse from panicking at the massive energy blast detonating right in front of him. He screamed in pure terror, unable to process the power Colin had just unleashed. Sweat poured down Freed Hall's forehead, his face painted with absolute panic as he watched the chaotic scene spiral completely out of his control. Colin spawned out of nowhere from high above, diving down like a lightning bolt with his sword drawn, locked in for the final critical strike. Colin's face was set in stone, letting out a roar that shook the entire forest as he closed the distance to his target. Freed panicked and popped his magic, brilliant purple lightning erupting as his expression shifted from shock to absolute, boiling rage the second he realized Colin was actually targeting him. A massive collision exploded between Colin Hall and Freed Hall. Purple lightning arced everywhere, hard proof that the arrogant noble had finally been forced to burn his own mana. Colin maintained his perfectly calm stance, flashing a highly sarcastic smirk as he watched Freed Hall struggle to block. He threw out a toxic taunt, saying he didn't expect this punching bag noble actually knew how to PvP. With an ice-cold glare, Colin warned Freed Hall to never underestimate him again. Freed, on the other hand, was so furious veins popped on his forehead, his face twisted in pure humiliation and hatred. A blinding purple magic explosion erupted from Freed Hall, blasting Colin backward and lighting up the entire dark forest. Colin stuck a flawless landing on the dirt, instantly resetting to a defensive stance, while the blades of the Empire assassins nervously hovered nearby. Colin's azure eyes narrowed. His radar picked up a massively threatening spike in the energy signature surrounding Freed Hall. Freed Hall screamed like an absolute maniac in a fit of berserk rage, ordering his minions to back the hell off so he could personally execute the target. The two assassins instantly fell back to reposition, physically feeling the colossal magic pressure rapidly stacking up from their boss. Sitting on his panicking horse, Freed Hall's entire body glowed with dense purple lightning. He went on a psycho rant, swearing he would be the one to personally take Colin Hall's life. Colin stared dead center into the brewing magic hurricane, his expression shifting to max-level seriousness and absolute focus. A violent vortex of purple energy condensed aggressively right in front of Freed's chest, forcing the noble to physically strain against the pressure as he unleashed his hidden ultimate. A colossal magic array packed with ancient runes spawned behind Freed, radiating a blindingly bright but absolutely lethal light. Daku watched from afar, completely shell-shocked. It looked like he recognized the identity of the horrifying magic array Freed was currently channeling. A mana-detected system prompt popped up as Colin faced the exploding power level. He calmly tanked the heavy winds blowing his dark hair back, his eyes locked onto the enemy. Colin let out a slight smirk, his deep blue gaze turning razor-sharp. He muttered that this raid was actually getting a bit annoying, but his aura still radiated absolute confidence. Colin was currently hitting the absolute hard cap of his physical body. The black curse marks on his face started violently vibrating under the spiritual pressure, sweat pouring down alongside a trail of blood from his mouth. Freed Hall was still trying to stand his ground inside the blinding purple lightning. He was panting heavily, but his eyes were still overflowing with killing intent, winding up for his ultimate attack. The purple lightning from Freed's hands violently flared up, generating explosive sparks all over his body. He dumped 100% of his power into his final casting stance. Colin didn't flinch for a second. He swung his sword, generating a massive, suffocating wave of dark blue aura. The cursed markings on his body glowed brightly, signaling a catastrophic incoming attack. An arc-shaped slash completely tore the fabric of space, leaving glowing blue energy shards fatting into the night. Colin's speed was so busted he was leaving actual afterimages behind. He dashed forward like a phantom, his blade dragging a freezing trail of blue energy. Chunks of shattered spiritual power exploded everywhere with every frame of his movement. The exact millisecond Colin's blade entered melee range, Freed's face completely warped in pure terror. He just stood there with his jaw dropped, cold sweat pouring down as the Grim Reaper came to collect. A massive collision triggered, but it wasn't between two blades. An apocalyptic shockwave blasted both players in opposite directions, kicking up a massive dust cloud that blinded the entire zone. Colin's eyes were terrifyingly cold, his dark ocular jutsu fully activated. Opposite him, Freed was in a state of absolute shock, finally realizing the lethal, unbridgeable stat gap between them. Suddenly, a glowing golden magic circle spawned dead center between the two, completely nullifying Colin's attack. This wave of righteous energy instantly purged all the dark aura in the area. The magic circle detonated, blasting Colin backward. He was launched through the air, his sword nearly knocked out of his hand by the intervener's absolutely overpowered force. Both young fighters were forcefully separated. Colin scrambled to reset his balance while the blue spiritual energy still flickered around his model like ghost fire. It turned out to be Marquis Darius Hall. He sat on horseback, one hand extended to sustain the barrier, coldly declaring, "That's enough." The Marquis's face was set in absolute, terrifying strictness. He dropped a massive reality check, reminding them this was a hunting zone, not a slave arena for them to freely PK each other. He ordered Freed that if he wanted to PvP that badly, he could wait until they got back to the estate. Darius's arrival instantly deleted the entire zone's aggro. Freed Hall kept his head down, sweat pouring down his face in pure terror of his father's crushing authority. He could only mumble a pathetic acknowledgement, not daring to run his mouth anymore. Colin looked at the Marquis, the black markings on his face starting to fade out. He realized this intervention didn't just save Freed's life, it perfectly covered up his own secret stats. He leaned on his sword, dropping to one knee from 0 stamina. Colin thought to himself he could finally log off and rest after pushing his hardware way past its limits. Darius stared intently at the black-haired teenager, his eyes deep in thought. It seemed he had already noticed something totally glitched about his adopted son. With his HP and stamina completely bottomed out, Colin collapsed onto the grass. His consciousness faded to black after dumping his entire mana pool into that last fight. A few days later at the Hall estate, the luxurious chandelier glowed brightly on the high ceiling, marking the end of a very long AFK recovery period. Colin slowly opened his eyes, his vision still slightly blurred from being stuck in a coma for days. He weakly muttered, wondering what spawn point he was at. Flashbacks of that dark, curse-heavy battle replayed in his brain like a laggy cutscene. That was the severe penalty for spamming power way above his level cap. He sat up in bed, grabbing his chest. His torn shirt revealed bandages covering wounds that had been expertly healed. Colin thoroughly inspected his hands, checking to make sure those creepy curse marks were completely unequipped. He breathed a massive sigh of relief, seeing his character model was back to default. "You're finally awake," a voice called out from the foot of the bed, making Colin snap his head around. Colin's eyes bugged out looking at the guy, unable to hide his shock at the NPC's totally wrecked character model. It was Daku, but he looked so trashed it was unbelievable. His deeply sunken eyes and massive dark circles made him look exactly like a walking zombie mob. Daku forced a laggy, awkward smile, saying good morning while looking ready to instantly drop dead. It seemed he had pulled multiple all-nighters grinding just to take care of Colin. Morning sunlight pierced through the window, lighting up the VIP tier room. Daku started dropping lore about how Colin instantly passed out right after that high-stress boss fight. A flashback cutscene rolled. Glenn had to literally carry Colin back, while Sierra went completely psycho, grabbing the medics by the collar and threatening to bury them all alive if Colin's HP hit 0. Colin just laughed awkwardly, sweat dropping hearing about his new party members' incredibly overdramatic reactions. He slipped his feet into his leather boots, feeling his HP had regenerated enough to walk around without debuffs. Colin stood up and stretched, thoroughly enjoying the feeling of his character model moving smoothly again. He decided to go track down Sierra and the squad to drop a thank you, and also farm some food to fix his depleted hunger bar. Colin flashed a soft, gentle smile, a super rare emote for his character. "Oh, right." He turned and dropped a highly sincere thank you straight to Daku. This bright smile instantly buffed the room's atmosphere, making it feel weirdly warm. Daku stood completely stun-locked for a few seconds, literally not believing his audio logs. He thought to himself, wow, this absolute edgelord actually knows how to say thank you. Afterward, the duo stepped outside together. A wide shot showed the entire estate zone rendered beautifully in the bright morning lighting. The servant NPCs immediately started whispering in the background. The second Colin spawned into the zone. They stared at him with a mix of pure fear and heavy curiosity after all the server drama. Colin and Daku casually strolled right through the gossip zone. Colin kept his poker face, completely ignoring the mobs staring at him like he was a glitched boss monster. Two maids were huddled together, aggressively gossiping about the PvP drama between Colin and Freed. They covered their mouths, totally unaware the target was right behind them. Colin suddenly teleported right next to them, leaning in and asking what the hell they were saying about him and Freed. The two girls nearly jumped out of their skins, their faces draining of all color from pure terror. The second the maids saw his player model, they bolted at max movement speed, screaming their lungs out like they just got jump-scared by a literal demon in broad daylight. Daku stood there looking absolutely dumbfounded, sweat pouring down his face. He muttered a joke that Colin looked exactly like a ghost that just respawned from the graveyard. Colin rubbed his chin, going into deep think mode over his friend's review. His face maintained its usual ice-cold, deadpan aesthetic. He nodded, accepting the feedback, but fired back a counter-roast saying the only reason he looked like a ghost was because Daku's face was currently as pale as a corpse. Daku instantly triggered his rage animation, screaming and asking whose fault that was. Heavy footsteps triggered from behind, grabbing the attention of the two arguing teenagers. It was the heavy leather boots of a military-class NPC. "I didn't ask you to pull an all-nighter to babysit me," Colin casually dropped, tilting Daku even harder. Right at that moment, a massive, highly aggressive guy completely body-blocked their path. The eye-patch vice captain spawned in, rocking his signature arrogant, toxic smirk. He raised his voice to mock Colin, sarcastically calling him the brilliant future lord to trigger max-level disrespect. The low-level guards behind him panicked, desperately trying to CC their boss, but he just screamed at them. They could only wave their hands apologizing to the teenagers, desperately trying to avoid catching any splash damage. The eye-patch guy glared with bloodshot eyes, sweat dripping down his temples. It looked like he was desperately trying to hold back a rage meter that was about to hit 100%. He clenched his fists, loudly declaring he came here today to completely settle his negative tab from their last encounter. His rage aura was practically burning right behind his model. Facing the enemy's aggressive taunts, Colin just stared at him with total indifference, basically treating the guy's hitbox like it didn't even exist. The vice captain swapped targets to Daku, assuming he was an easier mob to farm. He made up some garbage excuse, claiming he only lost the last trade because he lagged, which let a slave get the upper hand. He snapped his fingers with a loud pop, looking incredibly smug like he already had the victory screen locked in. He was 100% confident his pre-fight setup was flawless this time. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his eyes radiating pure toxic malice. He threatened that this run was not going to be anywhere near as easy as the tutorial phase. The eye-patch vice captain was still mouthing, coping hard that he only lost his last duel to Colin because of a dropped input. He snapped his fingers aggressively, screaming commands for the guard squad to instantly rush in and gank Colin. Colin stared dead into the guy's eyes with a hyperserious expression. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple at the enemy's sheer, psychotic stubbornness. He let out a highly disrespectful smirk. It looked like he already had a counter-strat cooked up for this grudge match. Seeing the guards still standing there AFK, the eye-patch guy went nuclear, screaming at them to attack the second they heard the audio cue. He furiously asked if they had completely forgotten their basic tutorial macros. The guards were shaking uncontrollably, whispering to each other that Colin was a literal raid boss who just soloed young Master Freed. Trying to PvP him right now was just speedrunning a game over. Daku started sweating as the mob size increased, while Colin just stood there with his arms crossed, spectating the whole clown show like an AFK player. The eye-patch guy toxically flamed his own squad, calling them a bunch of useless, cowardly bots. He knew damn well if he backed down now, his guild rep would hit absolute zero. A dark idea booted up in his brain as his eyes locked onto Daku. He flashed a highly toxic, sinister grin, thrilled to find a new target to dump his aggro on. Daku felt the incoming killing intent locking straight onto his hitbox, and sweat started pouring down his cheeks. He forced a laggy smile to hide his massive panic. "Even if I can't ban that little brat, I'll definitely wipe the floor with you," the eye-patch guy muttered to himself, his razor-sharp gaze fixing on Colin's partner. He suddenly dash-attacked, violently grabbing Daku by the collar, flaming him for being an ungrateful traitor who ditched young Master Freed to party up with Colin. Daku panicked as he was physically lifted right off the ground. The eye-patch guy aggressively announced he was stepping in for the young master to teach this traitor a brutal lesson. He wound up his massive fist, prepping to land a critical hit right on Daku's face to flex his dominance in front of the spectator lobby. But in a massive plot twist, Daku perfectly timed a block, stopping the guy's punch dead in its tracks like a brick wall, leaving the vice captain totally stun-locked. The eye patch guy's eyes practically popped out of his skull. He couldn't process how a slave mob had the base stats to casually parry his heavy attack. Daku's eyes turned razor-sharp and absolutely resolute. He dropped a heavy voice line, stating the guy had zero authority or admin privileges to judge his actions. With a flawless animation, Daku violently shoved the eye patch guy's arm away, breaking his posture and making him stumble back several frames. The vice captain was totally blue-screened, his brain lagging like he just took a hammer to the head after that counter. The low-level guards panicked and rushed to check on their boss, while he was still paralyzed by the sheer humiliation. Right on cue, heavy, authoritative footsteps triggered in the audio mix. A pair of hyper-polished Knight boots stomped onto the path with absolute presence. Knight Glenn spawned in, rocking his gray beard and a dead serious face. He roared, demanding to know what kind of trash was causing server lag this early in the morning. Flanking him were Sierra and the other elite knights, casually walking into the zone. The vice captain went ghost white the second he identified the high-tier VIPs that just loaded in. He tried to keep up his edgy persona, threatening Colin and Daku that now that the elite knights had spotted them, their accounts were as good as banned. Instantly, the eye patch guy did a total 180, groveling on his knees to welcome the three high-ranking knights. When asked what the hell was happening, he desperately tried to hijack the report. He pointed straight at Colin and Daku, completely lying through his teeth, claiming he was just disciplining some brain-dead slaves who didn't know the server rules. Colin instantly threw up a hand and casually greeted the knights like they were old guildmates he hadn't seen in years. Before the eye patch guy could even process the buggy interaction, he got hit with a heavy pat on the back that nearly made him face-plant into the dirt. Marvin threw his arm around Colin, laughing his ass off and congratulating him for respawning exactly when he predicted. This hyper-friendly interaction left the entire lobby absolutely mind-blown. The eye patch guy's jaw hit the floor. He couldn't comprehend why elite, high-tier knights were acting chummy with absolute bottom-tier slave mobs. Sierra also walked up, trolling Marvin about their bet on exactly when Colin would wake up. Marvin happily demanded she buy him a round of drinks tonight since he won the wager. The vice captain watched the friendly cutscene in pure horror, desperately praying this was just a bad VR simulation and not actual reality. The eye patch vice captain started screaming about server TOS and fairness, totally mouthing that low-tier slaves dared to act like equals with high-tier knights. Sierra literally teleported behind him, throwing an arm over his shoulder with maximum disrespect, announcing they didn't give a single damn about those outdated boomer rules. With an ice-cold smile, Sierra whispered a lethal threat into his ear, telling the eye patch guy to shut his mouth permanently if he wanted to keep his remaining eye. Knight Glenn led the party out of the zone, leaving the vice captain standing there completely petrified. The max-level tension in the area instantly dropped to zero. Colin flashed a highly arrogant, triumphant smirk, silently confirming to himself that he had secured the ultimate victory screen in this psychological PvP match. The loud clashing of wooden mugs shook the entire room, white beer foam spraying everywhere as the party celebrated their massive raid clear. The whole squad was grouped up around a chaotic tavern table. Colin quietly dropped a thanks to the knights for bailing him and Daku out of another lethal bottleneck. Sierra hyped up the chat, openly admitting she always hated that eye patch loser anyway, and firmly declared Colin and Daku were their highly respected saviors. Daku was super curious, turning to ask Sierra if she had some personal beef with the vice captain to be flaming him that hard. Sierra instantly triggered her rage animation, slamming her mug onto the table and yelling at Daku to stop asking useless questions because it was ruining her buffs from the alcohol. Glenn cleared his throat with a heavy, bassy cough to pull the party's aggro back to him. His face was suddenly locked into super serious mode. Glenn dropped a massive invite, offering Colin and Daku a slot in the Elite Knight Guild, an insanely rare, account-boosting opportunity for players tagged as slaves. Daku's eyes bugged out, pointing at his own face like his audio glitched, while Colin just sat there casually sipping his drink. Glenn promised that if they accepted the Elite Knight class, they would unlock VIP perks equal to the highest tier retainers in the estate. Colin gave a faint smile, but his dialogue was a total shutdown. He bluntly stated he had absolutely zero interest in grinding the night class. "I have much bigger and grander ambitions," Colin asserted, his eyes burning with an absolute, psychotic level of confidence in his own endgame. Glenn, Sierra, and Marvin went dead silent. Their faces were starting to glow red from spamming too many high-level alcohol consumables. Marvin slammed the table and roared, telling Colin to drop the insane dream of becoming the Lord of the Rhine, because that questline was literally impossible. He stated as an absolute fact that Colin didn't use standard sword hitboxes in that last fight. He 100% popped some kind of hidden, op-magic skill. Sierra suddenly jumped out of her chair, pointing right at Colin with a wildly hyped expression. She was absolutely convinced it was magic that let him solo the Azure King. Marvin narrowed his eyes suspiciously, genuinely confused about how a slave mob could possibly unlock and equip that kind of high-tier magic. Glenn stared a hole straight through Colin with crushing authority, demanding the kid drop a 100% honest lore dump for the squad. Colin thought to himself that the Knights had actually read his glitched stats way earlier than expected. He quickly booted up a flawless cover story. Luckily, Colin had already simulated this exact dialogue tree and prepped a highly convincing lie to mask his actual character background. Daku looked at Colin nervously, while Colin kept his face incredibly deadpan, winding up to deploy his totally fabricated backstory. Sierra's eyes were glued to Colin's face. She was on the edge of her seat waiting for every word to drop from the mysterious teenager's mouth. Colin quietly scanned the UI of everyone at the table, running probability checks on whether they would actually fall for his incoming script. Sierra flashed a highly suspicious smirk, acting like she had personally data mined the biggest secret Colin had been hiding this whole time. "You're actually a fallen noble, aren't you?" Sierra confidently announced, making the entire tavern room instantly go dead silent. She leaned over and aggressively grabbed Colin's hand, claiming her radar for high-tier aristocratic aura was never wrong. Sierra excitedly started writing a whole tragic fanfic about how Colin got griefed by a noble conspiracy and forced into the trash-tier slave zone. In Sierra's wild imagination, Colin was a high-class young master who swore to grind back all his lost glory using his own raw power. Daku's jaw hit the floor at Sierra's completely unhinged headcanon, wondering where the hell she pulled those patch notes from. Colin suddenly burst into loud, maniacal laughter, the audio bouncing around the tavern and completely deleting the tense atmosphere. He casually confirmed Sierra's wild theory, making her look incredibly smug since she fully believed she just solved the main storyline. Colin started acting deep, wiping away fake tears and reciting a tragic backstory about getting permanently banned from his noble family in the distant city of Ale. Colin clenched his fists, screaming in fake agony about how he was going to make the nobles who griefed him pay the ultimate price one day. Sierra and Marvin actually started crying over the tragic lore, while Daku stood in the background looking completely lost. Daku was sweating buckets, thinking it made sense for Sierra and Marvin to get scammed, but a veteran like Captain Glenn definitely wouldn't fall for such a garbage, low-effort lie. However, Glenn unexpectedly stood up looking incredibly serious and empathetic. He swore to keep Colin's hidden identity a secret as long as he didn't pull any aggro toward the Marquis. Daku's eyes practically popped out of his skull. He couldn't believe even the captain got 100% played by Colin's acting. Glenn dropped a heavy warning, telling Colin to be extremely careful and absolutely never leak his magic skills in front of Lady Katrina or the young master. Colin flashed a bright smile, totally smug that his stealth operation worked flawlessly beyond expectations. Daku announced that Marquis Darius Hall wanted to spawn him in for a meeting the second he woke up. Colin Hall just gave a slight nod to accept the quest. Glenn stood in the distance, quietly spectating the two teenagers' models as they walked deeper into the estate instance. Glenn turned back to group chat with Sierra and the other knights, a slight hint of suspicion still lingering on his face. A close-up on Marquis Darius Hall's face showed him deeply analyzing the name Ale City in his head. Walking down the hyper-luxurious corridor, Daku was still totally mind-blown that such a massive lie about noble status actually bypassed the admins. Daku turned to ask Colin why he specifically selected Ale City as his fake spawn point. Colin Hall explained that Ale was a completely chaotic PvP zone where nobody could verify shit, making it the perfect cover. A map UI popped up showing the insane travel distance between Ale and the Rhine territory, an absolutely flawless smokescreen. Daku scratched his head, trying to process the term smokescreen Colin just dropped. He suddenly remembered a side quest detail and mentioned he had been meaning to ask about this for a while. Daku threw up his hand, forming a bizarre gesture, and asked Colin if he knew anything about the Three-Legged Crow Guild. Colin stared at the hand sign in dead silence, while Daku wondered if this was just another one of his friend's distraction tactics. A flashback loaded of a dark, pitch-black night during a monster raid on a camp. A massive ogre boss had Daku in a total death grip. Colin Hall quick-drew his sword, his ice-gold eyes locked dead onto the boss monster. He muttered a quick apology to Daku. A flawless hyperspeed slash executed, the ogre's head was cleanly severed in a single frame. Blood VFX exploded into the air. Colin stood on the boss's corpse, telling Daku that if he had any final words for his little sister, he better survive and say them himself. Colin dashed in, swinging his blade at the lead ogre, but the tanky boss didn't go down easy, letting out a terrifying, screen-shaking roar. The monster raised its hand, blue magic bursting from its palm, carrying an absolutely devastating damage output. Colin's blade ignited with a lethal, dark blue spiritual aura. The monster still flashed a cocky, challenging grin, even as Colin's smoking blade closed in right on its neck hitbox. A massive mana explosion triggered. Colin was blasted backward through a cloud of blue smoke. He panted heavily, blood dripping from his mouth, as he desperately tried to tank the overwhelming spiritual pressure. The armored monster taunted him, asking if a low-level trash mob like him seriously thought he could get the kill. Suddenly, Daku rushed in from behind with his sword drawn, screaming his lungs out to pull the boss's aggro. Daku swung his sword with everything he had, declaring he was also an active player in this raid. The ogre's eyes widened in genuine shock, seeing a tiny slave mob actually dare to counterattack. The two of them synced up for the ultimate finishing combo. Monster blood rained down like a fountain under their rapid-fire critical slashes. Colin Hall panted heavily, desperately waiting for his stamina bar to regenerate after the hardcore boss fight. Amidst the ruins, blurry black silhouettes zipped past as Colin and Daku executed their final hit animations. After the aggro finally dropped, Colin went right back to flaming Daku about his long, super cringe final words. Instantly, the remaining mob packs all aggroed onto the duo. Meanwhile, Daku screamed back that Colin would be sitting at the game over screen if he hadn't peeled for him. The two stood there screaming at each other. Colin argued Daku's first voice line should have been "thank you" for not accidentally chopping him in half. Daku furiously brought up how Colin almost got the hostage killed with his hyper-reckless stunt just now. Colin coldly fired back that those monsters had absolutely zero intention of letting the hostage go anyway. Daku yelled, demanding Colin ping a warning signal next time. Colin sarcastically asked if he was supposed to literally shout, "I'm about to sneak attack," in server chat. In the background, the civilian and slave NPCs looked completely dumbfounded watching the two teenagers arguing in the middle of a blood-soaked PvP zone. The monster mobs were slowly routing. Colin dropped another toxic jab, mentioning that some crybaby was just wailing his little sister Erica's name a minute ago. The spectators were completely speechless at the absolute chaos their two saviors were causing. Daku suddenly threw his hand up, flashing the three-legged crow emote right in Colin Hall's face. He explained that an NPC named Roan taught him this secret sign back when he was locked in the Slaver Guild's inventory. A tight close-up highlighted the three-legged crow sign, a guild symbol for absolute unity and backup. Daku firmly stated that any player sharing their alignment would 100% jump in to assist the second they saw this emote. Colin turned and sarcastically asked if Daku was planning to get grappled by the monster mobs again. Daku furiously raised his fist, flaming him for being a stubborn troll. Snapping back to reality, Colin Hall looked off into the distance, explaining that an old acquaintance taught him that emote. But he dropped his voice, adding that the guy's account was permanently deleted. A super rare smile flashed on Colin's face as he trolled his best friend for being a stubborn idiot. He held up one finger, emphasizing the absolute unbreakable duo buff between them. Daku was sweating buckets, his face totally blue-screened with pure confusion. He frantically searched his memory logs from his slave days, but couldn't find any data connecting it to Colin. Colin firmly gripped his hand and knocked heavily on the thick wooden door of the admin office. From inside, an incredibly authoritative voice gave them clearance to enter. Stepping into the hyper-luxurious room, both players bowed deeply to show max respect to the Lord. Marquis Darius Hall sat in a premium leather chair, staring a hole straight through Colin. Marquis Darius Hall spoke with a deep, stable bass tone, kindly asking about Colin's HP recovery. His face radiated absolute authority, but still showed the genuine concern of a high-tier mentor. Colin Hall flashed a highly confident smile, firmly confirming his debuffs were totally cleared thanks to the premium healing. His eyes were dead-focused, showing zero fear against the Lord's massive aura. Daku also bowed respectfully. The Marquis recognized his character model, nodding and nodding. It had been a long time since their last dialogue tree. Darius's face suddenly went full serious mode. He lowered his head slightly, deep in thought. He announced there was exactly one specific reason he summoned them to this instance right now. The Marquis flipped through a stack of data logs, demanding a serious debrief on the exact sequence of events in the hunting zone. The glitchy details in the report clearly needed debugging. Daku kept his head down, anxiety sweat rolling down his cheeks as he felt the room's tension hit max level. In the background, Darius stood up from his chair, radiating absolute boss-level presence. Darius slowly walked toward the wall, where a massive, gold-framed portrait was hung. He dropped some lore, mentioning he had been partied up with Glenn and the others since the very early game. The Marquis's gaze locked onto the portrait of his elite squad. He nostalgically recalled how they had cleared countless hardcore raids together, surviving the game over screen more times than he could count. The painting showed a low-level Darius standing with his most trusted party members, all of them radiating raw, hardcore warrior energy. These were the exact players who helped him grind to the top of the server. Darius zoomed in on the painting, admitting he literally couldn't process the debuff of losing them permanently. He blamed his own stats for not detecting the bugged spawn rates earlier. He expressed massive gratitude that Colin and Daku spawned in just in time to save his 3 oldest party members. Darius sighed, thinking if his radar was better, he could have saved way more NPCs. The Marquis slowly shook his head, closing his eyes to suppress the emotional damage. He firmly assured the 2 teenagers they caught absolutely 0 penalty points for that incident. Darius tanked 100% of the aggro himself, admitting it was his admin failure for not predicting the monster raid. Colin and Daku stood in dead silence, listening to the Lord's heavy lore drop. Marquis Darius Hall spun around, bringing up the guild invite to the Royal Knights that Glenn had dropped earlier. He wanted to hear the official confirmation straight from their audio logs. Colin Hall instantly fired back without a single pixel of hesitation on his face. He bluntly rejected the invite to the Elite Knight Guild, a massive plot twist that would shock anyone else on the server. Darius didn't trigger any rage animations. He just turned to Daku and asked for his input. Daku instantly became the focal point of the entire room, visibly lagging from the sudden pressure. Daku froze, his hands waving around chaotically because the dialogue prompt caught him totally off guard. He stuttered, completely unable to form a sentence after being personally offered a Royal Knight slot by the server admin. The teenager nervously downplayed his own stats, claiming a trash-tier mob like him didn't deserve that kind of premium class. Colin stood next to him and immediately dropped a buff, telling Daku to just select the dialogue option he actually wanted. After a brief moment of intense internal processing, Daku's character model completely shifted. He ground his teeth, his eyes flaring up with an insane, unprecedented level of resolve. Daku screamed with absolute courage, firmly declaring he desperately wanted to class change into a Royal Knight. His shout echoed through the admin room, flexing a completely unbreakable mentality. Marquis Darius Hall gave a highly satisfied nod at Daku's hardcore resolve. He then turned to Colin, generously announcing that if the kid had any other custom requests, he should just drop them now. Colin Hall let out a faint, extremely calculated smirk, his eyes turning razor-sharp as he locked onto this golden opportunity. He opened his mouth to drop his one and only demand. Colin's face was packed with 5D chess calculations and a highly cryptic vibe. He requested the Lord's admin privileges to handle the situation with Daku's little sister. Colin demanded to transfer Erica, a servant currently locked in the Williams family instance, directly to the Hall estate server. Marquis Darius listened incredibly closely to this totally unpredictable request. Daku physically jolted, his eyes bugging out to max size, completely blue-screened by his friend's massive proposal. He couldn't believe Colin was burning the Lord's ultimate favor just to rescue his little sister from that toxic zone.